The young lady screamed with tears in her eyes and called for her father as her bound one was pulled along by the man. And she called her mother and also her sister, but it was all in vain. And with the last of her strength, the young lady pushed back with her feet and grabbed hold of everything she saw with her hands. The lady looked at the man with fury and asked her husband what he was doing. He angrily shouted at the man to leave her already. He shouted at the man that if he didn't finish before sunset, he would be thrown into the oven too. The man, gritting his teeth, told the young lady that he was very sorry. He asked her to follow him quietly, but she screamed and struggled. At that very moment, she grabbed hold of the pole and with tears in her eyes screamed that she wanted to live. The man froze in a daze, and at the same moment, everyone looked tensely at the girl. The Marquise looked at them with fury, and at the same moment snatched the spear from the knight. Leslie screamed and called for her father with tears in her eyes. But a moment later, he used his spear to push her into the burning building. He screamed furiously that she must die for her sister. He shouted that her sister was an innocent girl and she was useless. The young lady was shocked by her family's actions, but she had no choice but to slowly fall into the shackles of darkness. She was in shock, wondering if she would really die like this and remain forever a victim for her sister. Leslie knew she couldn't survive that kind of fire, but she turned around when she heard someone's voice. Leslie was in shock and very scared, but at the same time, she was drawn to the shadows she had never seen before. Leslie was confused because she knew this was her end. She screamed as the darkness enveloped her, but a moment later, she fell out of the window with a crash. Everyone present was in shock. Her life was dedicated to her sister. Father told her every time that she was useless, and therefore, as punishment, she should go without food. Her mother said that she could not answer the teacher's question correctly, so she would be punished. Her sister spoke with disdain that she was disgracing her in front of people, but she knew that this was not true, and it was just a mistake. Eli looked at her sister with contempt and said with fury that she had nevertheless blackened her name, and therefore she would answer for it in full. Meanwhile, the young lady kept falling and falling into darkness. Leslie just wanted a loving family to be by her side. Leslie only dreamed of being with her family no matter what, and she dreamed of being loved at least a little, because she wanted to feel warmth and care. Some time ago, she stood in bewilderment near the fitting room while all the servants circled around her. Madame looked at her with contempt and anger and said that she needed to be beautiful. She looked at the girl with a smirk and squeezed her face, but at the same time, she said that for this day she had to be beautiful. Now she realized that she had been naive then. Leslie knew she shouldn't have expected any kindness from her family. But now she just wanted to survive no matter what it took. After some time, she still fell with a crash to the ground and lay on the ground for some time. Some time later, her young lady opened her eyes. Leslie was taken aback and looked at her hands. Leslie was surprised and at the same time puzzled as she still managed to survive. But she still couldn't bear it and started crying loudly. She was in pain both physically and mentally because her family had betrayed her. She knew that no one had ever considered her part of the family. After some time, she finally collected her thoughts and slowly got out of bed, but her whole body ached. She was scared and didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing. From now on, everything would be different. She wanted to immediately give up her dreams of being loved, but she didn't know how to do it. But at that moment, she remembered the black magic that enveloped her. In the Empire, each noble family possessed a unique divine power or magic. Sperado family secretly mastered the most powerful magic, and they could also control darkness. However, children who possessed black magic gradually ceased to be born in the family, and gradually, the prince's mouth began to die out. Leslie had heard that many years had passed since the last child with this power was born. She wondered if this had anything to do with the voices she had heard earlier. She supposed she could find the answer if she secretly searched the library. But the young lady did not know that this could be postponed, and first she needed to act differently, since she knew that she needed strength. She wanted to find a force that would protect her, because the laws of the Empire stated that every family was obliged to support its child. She has 6 years left until she comes of age, so if she tries to run away now, the prince will use this law to bring her back to her family. She was confident that he would leave her alive, so she understood that she needed to come up with something, and urgently. Leslie stood up slowly, but turned around at the same moment as she felt the presence of magic. Leslie smiled and told the shadows that everything was okay. A moment later, the shadows hid under her bed. After some time, she confidently went downstairs and left her dark room. After some time, she walked along a beautiful corridor, which was beautiful from all sides. Leslie remembered her mother screaming contemptuously at her not to walk around the house because she was pathetic and looked disgusting. Leslie remembered being ridiculed and despised by everyone. They said that she was a useless child, and her sister was like a warm ray. She was always told that her confession was to live for her sister. But now she was determined not to listen to them and not to talk to them. Marquis reassured his daughter with a smile and said that they did not yet know when the right time would be. She was furious and couldn't understand why her sister hadn't burned up already. She screamed that, because of her sister, her powers had not yet awakened. She knew that if the sacrifice had been successful, she would finally be able to use her powers. The young lady froze in place in shock, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. Eli was furious because she knew that the people were whispering since she could not fully use her powers. Eli screamed at her father and asked if the reason her sister was still alive was because she was priceless to him. The man told his daughter that she was born only for her own good, because if her power had not awakened, they would have placed her as a maid of honor in the palace. But as soon as she received them, they gave birth to her specifically for Togo, in order to transfer her magic into his beloved daughter. The man said that people who are born with whitish hair like an old woman are often the most successful victims. Leslie was shocked, because everything had been planned: her death and even her birth. Leslie knew that if she awakened her powers, they would burn her and sacrifice her. At that moment, the lady made a decision for herself. Leslie suddenly stopped as she heard her father's voice persistently asking her where she was going that early morning. But at the same time, he called her useless trash. She asked with fury if she was really useless. At that moment, he was taken aback. Leslie looked at her father menacingly and said that she didn't think so. She also asked him to think about it. Leslie sighed heavily and said that if she was not at hand, he would be in a difficult situation. The Marquis angrily shouted at his daughter that she had become overly insolent only because she had survived, and that he therefore intended to kill her mind a little. He shouted that it was all for her sister and for the family. At that very moment, she furiously told her father to jump himself. The Marquis was taken aback, and the young lady leaving said that he could jump into the fire himself, since she did not intend to do anything like that again. The Marquis was stunned by her behavior and rushed towards her in anger. A moment later, he was taken aback and stood frozen in shock as he felt the shadows surround him. He was puzzled and did not understand what had happened, but at that very moment, the shadows followed their mistress. Leslie slowly walked up to the carriage and got into it. The man was taken aback and, looking at the young lady, said that the carriage was intended for her sister. Leslie sighed heavily and said that she knew it, but he had to take her to the temple. The man was taken aback and told the young lady to leave immediately. At that very moment, he grabbed her by the hand and angrily ordered her to get out immediately. But the young lady knew that she would never allow anyone to treat her like that again. She immediately hit him and asked how he dared to grab her hand. Leslie looked at him with fury and asked where he learned such manners from. Leslie looked at the man with fury and asked how he dared to raise his hand against a lady. All those present at the shooting were in place. The man wondered if it was just a dream, because yesterday she couldn't utter a word, and today she hit him and yelled at him. He saw her serious and menacing look. She asked with fury, since when the servants in the mansion contradicted their master. The man was taken aback and bowed at the same moment. He said that this carriage was intended for Eli. Leslie shouted furiously that it didn't matter. At the same moment, she said that she would get there herself. The man was taken aback, not expecting such a thing. Some time later, she sat quietly in the carriage, as she was a little nervous, because it was the first time she had slapped someone. Leslie sighed heavily and clenched her fist, knowing she no longer had to worry about the people who had neglected and tormented her. She was excited because she didn't know what they would do in the future, but now she intended to meet the monster princess. Princess Salvatore, a house with a history richer than that of the imperial family, which existed even before the founding of the empire. People believe that their ancestors were monsters. This is because no one could surpass their strength. They became famous for their power. Even while living in captivity, the lady knew about the Grand Duchess, the first of the Salvatores, who single-handedly burst onto the battlefield and tore off the king's head with her bare hands. It was also said that the princess was more powerful than any high-ranking house, and since she disappeared from prying eyes, several legends have survived to this day. There were rumors that her two sons had also inherited their mother's incredible strength. She knew that their power was only growing, and she did not know how strong they were. She didn't know if she could persuade her, but she knew that she didn't need to be afraid of books and nudes, because this time she lived under the same roof with real monsters. After some time, she put all her thoughts aside more easily, since she had already arrived at the temple. The young lady jumped out of the carriage with ease and looked at the coachman in bewilderment. She was surprised, because he extended his hand to her as she walked out. She looked away from him in embarrassment and told him to wait for her until she returned. She felt awkward and realized that she needed to teach him manners. Leslie sighed heavily, knowing that etiquette was not for a maid. At that very moment, she heard a conversation between aristocrats who were saying that the princess had not arrived on the island again. Madame said that many people came to the island to greet the princess. She was very sorry that the princess was not on the island. The young lady knew that the princess was known for not receiving guests, and even the imperial family could not meet with her. But even so, she had heard that the princess attended the annual meetings on the island, but she did not know when she would be able to meet the princess. After all, the marquis said that the next sacrifice would be in 6 months, so she wanted to find out everything quickly. At that very moment, she greeted the temple worker. She looked at the woman closely and said she would like to look at the Sparado family archives. Leslie knew that the family records of each line were kept in the temple. She knew that they contained information about all deaths within the family. She was well aware of the fact that the reason why her family wanted to sacrifice her was written down here. Madame apologized to the young lady and asked if she could somehow prove that she was a member of the Sparado family. She sighed heavily and told the young lady that if she could not prove that she was a member of the family, then she could not look through the book. She asked the girl if she had any kind of identification. If she could provide anything with the stamp of her family's coat of arms, as proof, she would certainly give her the book. Video was taken aback and froze in place. She said that she was in a hurry and forgot, but asked if she could confirm her identity with the carriage, since it had a coat of arms on it. Madame said that this was enough. She looked closely at the girl and said that she had heard she was not feeling well, but still she was pleased that the young lady had visited them. After some time, they entered the library. The madam gave the young lady several books and said that the books were written in Gorski. Leslie immediately said that she could read this language without any problems. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was simply amazing, because usually this language was only studied at the academy. Leslie looked away from Madame shyly, as it was the first time she had been praised, and so she thanked her for such words. Her sister was busy being close to the princess, and she meanwhile studied hard, so she knew a lot of things. Madame wished the young lady good reading. Leslie sighed heavily when she was left alone with the books. At that very moment, she slowly began to examine the books. She wanted to find out who died at an early age. She understood that if the stories about sacrifices were true, then there must be many people who died in their youth. A moment later, she found information about death by fall, drowning, robbery, and an unknown disease, a bunch of different reasons why children died. And yet they all died without ever reaching adulthood. She was taken aback when she realized that they all had brothers or sisters. From reading the books, she realized that whether alive or dead, she would always be oppressed. She understood that being a member of this family, she must die for its good. At that very moment, she was taken aback because she heard a voice telling her that she needed to run. A moment later, she burst into tears and wondered if she could hear the voices of all those burned children. She knew they were all trapped in the fire. She felt a strong anger. She knew that the children who were sacrificed had been storing up their anger for the last millennium. She burst into tears, but at the same time, she was agreed upon and wanted to take revenge for them all. She wanted nothing left of her family and wanted revenge. Sometime later, she left the library and met Madame on her way. But she didn't stop and rushed towards the exit with lightning speed. She was alarmed and puzzled, but she still ran because she did not know what to do. At that very moment, she was taken aback as she accidentally slipped. She was in shock because she understood that she was falling and the fall was inevitable. But after a few seconds, she was taken aback and froze in place in surprise. At that very moment, the young man asked her with a gentle smile if she was okay. He smiled and thanked heaven that she wasn't hurt. Leslie was taken aback, but the young man cleaned the dirt from her dress, and at that very moment she thanked him as he was very kind. He smiled and said that it was a trifle, and she should not thank him, but he handed her a small handkerchief. She froze, not knowing what to do, but still accepted the handkerchief. Some time later, her young lady arrived back home. At that very moment, Sister pounced on her and hugged her tightly. Leslie froze in shock, not understanding what was going on. She turned her gaze to the entire crowd that was near the entrance to the estate. And at that very moment, she noticed the Emperor's son, Prince Orlando. She glanced sideways at her sister, now realizing the reason for her behavior. Eli, with tears in her eyes, told her sister that she was very worried about her since she suddenly took the power carriage and disappeared. Leslie looked at her sister hard as she was acting out of tune and disgustingly, and at the same moment she pushed her away. Eli looked at her sister with rage and called her, but she also glanced sideways at the prince. Eli screamed at her sister. She can't even imagine how worried she was about her, and she treated her like this. She fell to the ground with a crash and asked her sister how she could have done such a thing to her. She couldn't bear it and started crying very loudly. Leslie froze for a moment, but she saw all the angry and contemptuous looks that were directed at her. Her sister mocked her because she couldn't understand how Leslie could do such a thing in front of the prince. Leslie sighed heavily as she realized that her sister intended to behave in this manner. Eli looked at her sister with a satisfied grin as she understood that it was time for her to come down to earth. Leslie sighed heavily as she saw that people were all staring at them. She knew that they would be discussing her instead of her sister. She remembered the servants casually dragging her into the room. Then they, mocking her, said that the Marquis had ordered that she not be given food as punishment. They mocked her, telling her that it was an order, so they couldn't do anything. She knew that not only the servants, but also the teachers mocked and humiliated her, but at the same time, they also used physical force. She looked at everyone present with fury as she realized that they were all the same. But from now on, she did not intend to be their victim. Leslie walked up to her sister and suddenly asked if she was really worried about her. Eli looked at her sister in bewilderment, as she didn't understand what was going on at all since she was supposed to leave quietly. She hugged her sister tenderly and said that of course she was worried about her. Leslie said that she was the sister who treasured her so much that she threw her into the fire. Eli told her sister to shut her mouth because she was worried that the prince would hear their conversation. Eli looked at her sister mockingly and said that she looked like she cried over every little thing. Leslie asked her sister with a fierce grin how it was that she was saying the same thing as the Marquise. Eli froze in shock and trembling asked her sister where she got this power from. But at that very moment, Leslie, with a fierce grin, told her sister to keep quiet, since no one except them knew that she had power. She looked at her sister with a grin and said that when the Marquise finds out, then it will be she who will bring glory to their house, and he will give her all his love and attention. Eli froze in place for a moment and trembled with fear. At that very moment, she was taken aback and fell to the ground, staring intently at her sister. Leslie smirked and told her sister to be quiet, as she didn't need the monster's love at all. As she was leaving, she told her sister that if she didn't keep quiet, she would have problems too. Eli was taken aback and tried to stop her sister. She rushed towards her sister and grabbed her by the sleeve, but in doing so, she tore her dress. Eli froze in shock as she realized that the prince had seen everything. Leslie looked at the prince with a smirk and told him to look at the gift from her sister. With a sneer, she asked if it was elegant. Without paying attention to anyone, she calmly entered the house. Some time later, the maid ran hurriedly into the young lady's room and began calling her. She abruptly pulled her blanket off her and shouted that she was just a crazy girl. She was furious and did not understand how the girl could behave like that in front of her mistress. She screamed that the prince almost got it all wrong. Leslie looked at the maid in surprise and fury and asked what she was talking about. The maid screamed that they had heard and seen everything, and they knew that she had received these burns when she foolishly played with a teapot on a family holiday. Leslie looked at her burns in confusion, and at that very moment, looking at the maid, she asked if her sister had really told her all that. The maid was furious and shouted that they tried to convince her, but she still caused problems. At that very moment, she dragged her young lady along with her in fury. She shouted, looking at the girl, that they would immediately go to the lady and she would apologize to her for her lie. She shouted that their lady was very kind and she would forgive her sister. Rhea screamed that it was because Leslie was screwed by her habit of lying. Leslie immediately tore herself away from the maid and shouted that she was not going anywhere. She screamed that she would not apologize because she really did not lie. She also screamed that her sister left her with this scar. But a moment later, she became filled with anger, and with tears in her eyes, said that it would be more accurate to say that her entire family gave her this burn. The maid was shocked by what she heard, and screamed that the young lady was simply crazy. She looked at the girl as she had raised her to be calm and polite like a puppet. Rhea taught her to be a perfect lady, but now she was anything but. Rhea shouted to the girl that she would tell everything to the Marquis. She was furious and couldn't understand how the young lady could speak so boldly to her nanny. Leslie casually told the nanny that she could go and tell him everything right away. She sighed heavily and told the nanny that if she understood everything, then she could leave because now she wanted to rest. Rhea was shocked by the young girl's actions. At that moment, she rushed towards her as she wanted to punish her. A few seconds later, she fell to the ground with a thud as the young lady defended herself with her power. Leslie sighed heavily because her nanny was annoying her and she hoped that she would just go away, but she was screaming that she was dying. At that very moment, the young lady was taken aback as she heard her sister's voice. Eli looked casually at the nanny and told her to leave immediately. Eli screamed angrily and told the nanny that she had to crawl since she couldn't stand up. Rhea was shocked, but she still crawled out of the room with the last of her strength. Eli slowly closed the door and told her sister that they needed to talk. Leslie turned around and said she didn't want to talk to her. But at that very moment, the young lady rushed to her sister. Eli looked at her sister with fury as you were revealing your power. And because of it, she was able to survive when she fell off the cliff. She screamed that it was her magic. But unfortunately, she didn't know how her sister managed to take possession of her power. She screamed at her sister that since they were using her, she should just sit in the room. Leslie looked at her sister in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about. Eli said with a satisfied smile that she was the firstborn in the family, and she had blonde hair and green eyes, which were the hallmarks of their family. She told her sister to look at herself because she had dull gray hair. Eli said with a contented smile that she was charming. She said with disdain and mockery that the whole country deserved this power. Leslie looked at her sister in bewilderment as she was talking complete nonsense. She was disgusted to hear such things. Now she knew what her beauty was made of. She knew that the family's wealth and glory were based on the blood of innocent people. She was disgusted by all this. Eli mockingly told her sister that she seemed to understand that the elder sister was very happy. Eli looked at her sister with disdain and told her to live in the mansion for another 6 months, like a dead mouse. At that very moment, Leslie told her sister that she and the nurse were stupid, since she said that she would go down and tell the Marquise everything. She said that since she had power, she would show everyone. She asked her sister what she thought the Marquise's reaction would be. With the speed of lightning, the young lady threw open the door, and her sister was taken aback. Leslie glared at her sister and told me to get out immediately before she changed her mind. Leslie looked at her sharply and said that if it didn't interfere with her sleep, she would keep the fact a secret. Eli was burning with anger and fury, but she still did as sister told her to eat. A moment later, Leslie quietly lay down on her bed. Some time later, Leslie went down to the dining room and ordered the servants to bring her something that a normal person could eat. The maids were taken aback when she pushed the plate away. The servants were puzzled because the master had ordered them to give her only certain foods so that she would not gain weight. But after some time, she still managed to convince them, and they brought her normal food, and the young lady enjoyed the food with delight. But moments later, she heard a familiar voice. The madame looked at her daughter in surprise and asked if she had just woken up. She looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really eaten it all herself. She glared at her daughter as she ignored her. Eli called out to her mother as she wanted to stop her. Some time later, the man informed the lady that they had arrived at the place, but he did not understand why she should go to such a dangerous place. He said that the princess was very strong, and she did not lose her power because of the demon's blood in her blood. He was worried and asked the young lady if she wanted to go back to the mansion, but Leslie had no intention of doing so. She told the coachman to wait until she returned. She got out of the carriage slowly as she intended to meet the princess. A few minutes later, she told the knight to tell the princess that she would like to speak with her. After some time, the princess was informed that a young lady had arrived to see her. She asked her assistant in surprise who had come to visit them. A moment later, the princess looked out the window and noticed a little girl. She was a little worried and puzzled, as she could not tell how old the girl was, as her children had always been large and tall. She was surprised, as she did not know that the Marquis had another daughter. The woman told the princess that the Marquis had another daughter, but she was in poor health. The princess thought for a moment as she remembered the Marquis, who with a satisfied grin said that their family would return to its former glory since they had Elie. He said with a joyful smile that she was very beautiful, but she also had something else. He looked at the princess with a grin and told his comrade that he couldn't even imagine how happy he was when they discovered something in her. The princess thought for a moment, as she knew that many felt no affection for her family, because they were the only ones who had not lost their power since the founding of the empire. She sighed heavily and told her assistant that the girl would soon freeze and leave so they could ignore him. Madame sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. The coachman looked closely at his mistress and said that they had better return before she froze. Leslie told the man to leave. He was surprised and did not understand how she would return without a carriage, but she said that she would figure it out herself. She told the man to tell her father that she would spend the night in prayer to wash away her sins, and she also asked him not to talk about the princess. The man was taken aback and froze for a moment, but still shouted to his mistress that she should not forget that he had tried to stop her. He shouted that if something doesn't work out, then it's not his fault for the situation. The young lady sighed heavily and continued to wait. She looked intently at the beautiful castle as she intended to meet the princess. After several hours of work, the princess sighed heavily as she finished her work. She was tired because a lot of work had accumulated. She knew she had to find a suitable child and rest, but she knew a little that her sons couldn't be relied upon. She knew that one child was an exact copy of her, and therefore he was too unceremonious, and the other had a very difficult character. At that very moment, she was taken aback and froze in shock on the spot as she saw that the girl was still waiting. She remembered that their family had a high mortality rate among children. She didn't know what had made this child so desperate. A moment later, the assistant informed the princess that dinner was ready. The princess smiled and said that she would have dinner a little later, because the first thing she wanted to do was meet the guest. After some time, the young lady was already sitting in the castle. The lady looked at the girl with a smile and asked if she was warm enough. She also offered her a hot cup of chocolate. She said with a smile that she had put in a little sugar so that the young lady could enjoy it to the fullest. Leslie smiled and thanked Madams. At that very moment, the young lady felt a sweet aroma and warmth. But to her regret, she was careless and accidentally dropped the cup. Leslie apologized and immediately ran to the cup as she wanted to quickly clean everything up. With tears in her eyes, she screamed that she would clean everything up immediately. She was very afraid that they would yell at her. The madam looked closely at the girl and reassured her, and also informed her that the carpet could be cleaned and the tea made again. She sighed heavily and said that with such frozen hands, this was to be expected. A moment later, the madame brought the young lady a warm blanket and also informed her that she would soon bring her another cup. The madam noticed that the young girl really liked the blanket. Leslie smiled as she had the impression that she was touching a cloud. After some time, the princess entered the room and asked her for forgiveness. Leslie froze for a moment as she was struck by the beauty of the princess. She was shocked because she saw that the princess was incredibly tall. She thought that the princess was taller than the tallest knight they had on their estate. The princess looked at the lovely young lady with a smile. The princess smiled and said that the young lady even managed to steal the heart of her majordomo in no time. Jenna introduced herself with a smile and said that she was a butler at the princess's estate. The young lady was taken aback, as she thought that the person in front of her was a maid. She realized that she should apologize. Jenna said with a smile that the young lady should not apologize, as it was rather strange that she, a woman, was her butler. At that very moment, she heard a knock on the door. A moment later, a maid came in and brought them a wonderful treat. The princess looked intently at the young lady and called her because she wanted to know the reason why the girl came to her estate. At that very moment, Leslie confidently said that she had come to her because she had a request for the princess. The princess looked at the girl in surprise, with a tender smile. Leslie started to speak, but at that very moment, Jenna said that she would leave, and they could talk normally. A moment later, Jenna disappeared behind the door and wished them a pleasant conversation. At that moment, a tense silence fell between them. The young lady plucked up her courage and, looking at the princess, asked to adopt her. She begged the princess to make her the first lady of the family. The princess was taken aback, as she had never heard anything like this before, except that there were a few girls who wanted to fictitiously marry her son. She looked closely at the girl, because she knew that she was the Marquis's daughter. However, she saw her gaze, which was well known to her. She looked closely at the girl and asked why she should do this. She saw that the girl was struggling to live, being driven into a corner. Leslie said that if the princess did something like that, she would get what she had always wanted. At that very moment, the young lady used her power and plunged the entire castle into darkness. All the servants were shocked. People were very scared and did not understand what was happening at all. At that very moment, the princess, taken aback by shock, looked at the girl in surprise. Leslie looked intently at the princess and said that she would have the most powerful patron of the empire on her side. The princess laughed hysterically and asked the young lady how she knew what she wanted. Leslie said confidently that she didn't know that. But she heard that, alas, recently, the princess had been looking for a little girl in orphanages. The princess smiled and said that it looked like there was a rat under their roof. She looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked why she was asking to be adopted. Looking at Leslie, she understood that she was the daughter of a marquise and that she was not in danger of hunger and hardship. Leslie was taken aback because she knew that this was not true. She said that she would like to be under the princess's protection until she came of age. She said that after coming of age, she would leave the family herself and would gladly leave behind any inheritance and power. The princess was taken aback for a moment, as she had not expected such a thing. She wanted to live an ordinary and normal life, which would belong only to her, so she begged the princess to take her into her family. The princess was taken aback for a moment and said that she had the impression that there were some other reasons. Looking at the girl, she asked her to tell her everything without concealment. Leslie looked at the princess intently and said that she would like to send her family to the very bottom with the help of the princess's power. The princess said that she would help her with this, but asked why she came to her, since she could have gone to the royal family, and they would have protected her. Leslie said that the punishment from the royal family would be minor, as they understand that it would upset the balance between the nobles if one of the families was suddenly destroyed. Lassie said that there was also a high probability that the royal family knew her family's past, because something that had been going on for 1,000 years, they could not help but know. She knew that the royals had strong support and could gain even more power and glory at the expense of her family if they allowed them to escape punishment. Looking at the princess, she said that she was 12 years old. She is not a genius, but she learns quickly, and she also tried her best to survive. The princess looked closely at the girl studying her. She realized that the girl just wanted to be loved. She looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile, as she liked her even more. At that very moment, she asked Leslie if she had heard about her, before Leslie said that she had heard that the blood of monsters flowed in the princess. She also said that she heard that part of the princess's face was covered with scales. The princess sighed heavily, since the young lady still knew party. At that very moment, the princess told the girl that she was going to take off her mask and that she should get ready, as the sight would be very frightening. A moment later, the princess removed her mask, and the young lady froze. Leslie looked intently at the princess, not knowing what to answer. The princess smiled and said that she received this scar in the war, when she was betrayed by people she trusted. She knew that children usually cried when they saw something like this. She understood that the girl was very brave, since she didn't burst into tears when she saw something like this. Leslie, looking at the princess, asked if her scar hurt. The princess was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. At that very moment, Leslie said with tears in her eyes that he looked very sick. The princess asked the girl in surprise if she wasn't afraid. Leslie smiled and said that she wasn't afraid because she had a similar scar. She looked at the girl with a tender smile because she was different. She walked away from her and said that this scar does not hurt because it is many years old. At that very moment, she said that she would announce her decision. But after a few seconds, Anna heard a rumbling sound. The young lady was very embarrassed by this. She was very ashamed. At that very moment, she smiled at the princess and said that it seemed she had made a stupid mistake. She extended her hand to the young girl and asked if she would like to have dinner with her that day. After some time, the maids watched the princess and her guests quietly. At the same time, the young lady was enjoying the wonderful food with admiration. She was very happy because she ate even better food than at home. But at that very moment, she heard the voice of a young man. The young man approached his mother and said that he heard that they had a guest. He froze for a moment when he saw the little girl. He looked at his mother in bewilderment, as he had hoped that she would introduce the girl. At that very moment, the princess said with a satisfied smile that this was her daughter. The young people froze in place for a moment in shock. The princess looked at her new daughter with a smile and said that the young man would now be her older brother. The princess looked at us and told him to introduce himself immediately, calling him by his shortened pet name. He sighed heavily, just as he had previously asked his mother not to call him by that name. He slowly approached the young lady and said that he was the commander of the Lynch Knight's order. He also said that his name was Betrian Lacan Salvator. Everyone present was shocked as they understood that this was not the way to communicate with children. They were very worried because they understood that she was very small and could cry from such pressure. But the young lady in turn quietly jumped off her chair, and at that very moment she bowed and introduced herself with a smile. Everyone present was shocked as the girl did not cry, and moreover, she was polite. The princess smiled and told her son that this conversation between brother and sister was a bit too formal. The princess looked at her son and asked him how old he thought the girl was. He looked at her, intently assessing her. Betrian was confused and didn't know how old she could be. The moment he said he thought she was 5 years old, Leslie froze in shock. At that very moment, he looked back as the servants were whispering among themselves and did not think that she was older. The young man consoled her, not knowing what to answer, and the princess in turn held back her laughter. He said confidently that he was 4 when he was about her height. Leslie looked at the young man intently and said that she turned 12 this year. He was shocked because he did not expect this. The princess smiled because she understood that he should not have compared their family with normal people. The princess looked at the girl with a smile and asked her to come closer. The princess smiled and told the girl that her son did not understand hints, but she also said that she had another son and he would soon be born. Looking at her son, she said with a smile that the first impression was not the best. She also asked the girl if she liked the food. Leslie smiled and said that she liked everything. She said with a smile that she had never tried anything like this before, and today she found herself in heaven. At the same time, the chef burst into tears of happiness as he finally received a reward for his efforts. At that very moment, the princess asked the girl if the Marks would look for her, since it was already too late. She was a little nervous and didn't know how to answer, so she looked away. Leslie hesitated and said that she had asked the coachman to tell them that she would stay in the church and pray all night. She looked at the princess and said that she shouldn't worry. The princess smiled and said that this was very good news, and then she could spend the night with them. At that very moment, the princess reached out to the young lady and wanted to check the condition of her body. She slowly rolled up the sleeve of her dress and saw the scars on her arm. The princess saw that the girl was seriously injured and realized that she had not received any help after the incident. She looked at the girl with pity as she realized that she was in great pain. She said that she would ask the priest for treatment before she left. Some time later, the young lady lay quietly in bed, feeling everything as if she were in a dream. Some time ago, a priest saw a girl and looked at her with pity since the wounds were very serious and she had not received treatment. But after a few seconds, he used his power and healed her. At that very moment, the young lady looked intently at her beautiful hands. She pinched herself to realize it wasn't a dream. She was very happy, and at the same time surprised that the princess so easily accepted the child who arrived without warning. She knew she had to remain vigilant, as she had no idea what the princess would ask of her. She understood that she would not allow herself to be used anymore, because she wanted to choose her own path. Leslie knew she had a lot to discuss with the princess if she wanted to get the deal done right. At the same time, the young man came to his mother, as he wanted to talk to her about the girl. He said that she could have chosen anyone but not the Marquis's daughter, because he was sure that this would have consequences. She knew about everything, but she was sure that she had to adopt her. He asked in surprise if she was really just our price. The princess smiled and said that she had great potential. She said that she simply had no choice since the girl begged her, and she as an adult had to help her. 1,000 years after the founding of the empire, when the situation with the confrontation between people in the empire worsened, a detachment called Itai appeared. But no one knew why they needed to destroy the small village. Then the princess told her subordinates that they would return as soon as they buried the dead. She didn't understand why they had to kill children and old people. Some time later, the maid was smiling as she collected the young lady and asked if she wanted a ribbon. Leslie was a little surprised, but at that same moment she saw many beautiful ribbons. She was a little puzzled and did not understand why the maid was asking her opinion. The maid with a smile asked the girl to choose the ribbon that she liked best. She smiled and told the young lady that she could wear all the ribbons. Leslie smiled and asked if that was possible. The maid smiled and said that she could choose the one that looked best on her. The maid looked at the girl closely and said that a blue ribbon would suit her better, but Leslie wanted a nice green ribbon. She really liked the green ribbon as it resembled the princess's beautiful eyes. After some time, the young lady came down to the princess. The princess greeted the young lady with a smile and asked if she had slept well. Leslie said with a smile that she had slept well because the room was very cozy. She also bowed and thanked the princess for her wonderful hospitality as well as for the beautiful ribbon. But at the same time, she noticed the door, which was ajar, as she heard some noise. The servants happily whispered among themselves as they liked the young lady very much. The princess smiled and told the girl to sit down, as she wanted to have breakfast first and then discuss everything. The young lady was very surprised when she saw a variety of exquisite dishes in front of her. The princess smiled and told the girl that there were no rules of etiquette for eating in their estate, so she could eat as much as she wanted. Leslie looked at everyone present and thanked them. She also looked at the chef and thanked him for the wonderful food. Everyone was pleased with her gratitude. She was a little puzzled as she saw that there was no one else in the dining room except for her and the princess. She asked for forgiveness and asked the princess where her son was. The princess smiled and said that her son was most likely having breakfast after his morning training, so she did not need to worry, and she could already start eating. The young lady thought for a moment, for when she arrived at the estate, she saw only the princess and her son. She happily ate different dishes while everyone watched her and admired her facial expression because they saw that everything was written on her face. But at the very moment when the princess turned around, everyone quickly hid. She looked intently at the girl and called her. The princess told her companions with a smile that they had something else to discuss. The young lady in turn confirmed with a nod. The princess smiled and told her companion that she was a very smart girl, so she should have already understood what she wanted to talk about. The princess said with a smile that she would like to adopt her. Leslie thanked the princess, but Madame said that she did not need thanks because she wanted to use her as soon as the need arose. Leslie looked closely at her books as she realized that she was not just a stranger to the estate. The princess sighed heavily and said that adopting a girl who is already the daughter of another noble house is quite problematic, especially if this family is the Marquise. She knew that usually the reasons for adoption were due to problems with inheritance or conception. Only in such cases was the adoption of children from another noble family considered. Leslie looked at the princess intently and said that she could adopt her because it was her. The princess looked closely at the girl and said that everything was correct and she could do it. She said that there were several families that were more influential than the Marcus family, and her house was one of them. She smiled and said that she needed time to prepare the basic papers. If she wanted to adopt her, she also needed to persuade the imperial family. She was sure that the rest of the nobles would probably try to stop her. She also said that she had several enemies, and they were quite annoying. The princess sighed heavily, and looking at the girl, said that the most important thing in this matter was her parents, because she could not simply take the peacefully living Leslie away from her biological parents without their consent. Leslie was taken aback because she did not think about her blood at all. She wondered if she needed their permission. Looking at the princess, she asked how long she had to wait. The princess sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that she would have to wait about a month. Leslie was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing. She was very worried and wondered if she could ask the princess to let her live on her estate. She wanted to stay with her and did not want to go back. She did not want to see anyone else in her old life. Leslie threw all her thoughts away. She did not understand why she was thinking about such nonsense. She understood that if she immediately began to live on the princess's estate, then disagreements would arise between her family and the princess. Leslie understood that even the imperial family and other nobles would not be able to approve everything so quickly and settle it within a month. She understood that such a rush for the princess could end in overwork. She knew that she should not ask for anything more. At that very moment, she did not ask the girl in the book if anyone from her family knew about her powers. Leslie, looking at the princess, said that only her sister and no one else knew about her powers. The princess asked if her sister could keep the information a secret. Leslie said that her sister would definitely keep it like his secret, since she did not want her to gain the Marquis's attention. Leslie understood that she no longer needed his love. The princess looked at the girl and said that she would not like to be valued more. Leslie looked at her in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was being discussed. She said that if her family found out about her magic, they would definitely not let her go, and she might also be haunted by something more powerful, namely a large two-headed snake. The young lady was taken aback because she realized that the princess meant the imperial family by the two-headed snake. The princess said that they could be different from ordinary snakes because this was a very greedy snake. She told the girl that she understood who she was talking about. Leslie sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. The princess looked at her closely and said that she had several requests. She asked the girl to remain silent and not to spread about her strength. The princess also said that the young lady should try not to get injured anymore or still resist any injuries inside the house. She said that if the young lady found anything suspicious, she should contact her immediately, and if the princess was unable to help her, she would send her sons. Leslie looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she should do. The princess sighed heavily and, asking for forgiveness, said that it was still difficult to talk about such things. At that moment, Leslie's face darkened as she remembered that the princess had said that a rat had appeared under their roof. She was very worried that her family might find out where she had been and what she had been doing. She was scared because she used her power that day. She was very worried that her father might realize that she used her power. He might also find out what she talked about with the princess. She was worried that he would not let her leave. She was very upset and scared because she now realized that she shouldn't have done anything like that, and she should have just sucked it up and left. She wondered what if she was never allowed to leave her room again. At that very moment, the princess looked at the girl with a gentle smile and asked her not to worry. She said with tenderness in her voice that now Leslie had her, and everything would be fine. Leslie was taken aback, as she did not expect such warm words addressed to her. But after a few seconds, she looked at the princess with a smile and said that it was so. Some time later, the young lady returned to her house. At the same time, the princess closely watched the young lady, who was slowly leaving their house. She looked at her son with a smile and asked if he had finished training. She noticed that he had been training for a very long time. Betrian sighed heavily and told his mother in bewilderment that he was not used to such small creatures. The princess smiled and told her son that he still needed to get along with her, since she would soon become his sister. The princess said with a smile that she really hoped that she would be able to introduce the girl to her son and husband. She was upset that they were not at home. She knew that her husband would be very happy because during her first pregnancy, he was very excited and wanted them to have a girl. They had already chosen a name for her and arranged a room. But in the end, they had a beautiful son. He sighed heavily and said that they would find out when they returned. At that very moment, the princess sighed heavily and told her son that a rat had appeared under their roof because the Marquis knew that she had sent people to orphanages. She was furious and did not understand how he dared to do something like that. But she was even grateful to him, since she managed to meet a young and beautiful girl. She assumed that the Marquis did not even know that his daughter, whom he abandoned, was so calm and mature, and she also had a lot of plans for her family. The young man looked after his mother and said that he would take care of everything. Madame smiled and said that she was really counting on him. Some time later, the young lady returned home, where she met her evil sister Eli, who furiously asked her sister where she had been. Leslie ignored her sister and casually said that she was at night prayer. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as her sister grabbed her hand. Eli looked at her sister with fury and told her not to lie to her. She screamed that she knew perfectly well that her sister never spent the whole night in prayer. She wanted to know what her sister was praying for since it took her so long. Leslie took her hand away from her sister and asked angrily why she needed to know such a thing. She didn't understand why she should tell her sister anything. Leslie screamed at her sister that she didn't care what she did, so she shouldn't interfere in her business. Eli was furious and bolted her sister. She screamed that if she sent anyone to the church, her lies would come to light. Leslie looked closely at her sister, as she knew that they had been to church yesterday, so there was no need for her to continue the conversation with sisters. She was careless, told her sister that she could do whatever she wanted there. The young lady was burning with anger and fury, but a moment later, Madame came out to them because of the loud noise. She looked at my beloved daughter with a tender smile and asked why she was screaming so much. The young lady rushed to her mother in a hurry. Madame was still very agitated as she did not understand what had happened. The Marquise looked tenderly at her lovely child, as she did not know what had made her beautiful daughter behave in such a way. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. And at that very moment, the Marquise looked with contempt at her second daughter. She looked at her with fury and asked what she had done to her daughter. Leslie froze for a moment and looked at her mother with fury. She was very offended since the Marchioness was the one who gave birth to her, and yet she did not even consider her her own daughter. The Marquise was furious because the girl dared to ignore her. She screamed at Leslie that she needed to be punished, and therefore she had to go to the mirror room immediately. Leslie froze in shock when she heard something like that. She remembered all the horrors that happened to her when she was in the mirror room. Leslie screamed furiously that she no longer wanted to be their daughter, and therefore, from that moment on, she did not want to go there voluntarily. Leslie, in turn, really wanted her entire family to be swallowed up by darkness, but she understood that she had to hold on because her family deserved more punishment. At that very moment, she quickly turned around and rushed to her room. Madame was furious because her daughter had not heard her, but Leslie knew that she had to be patient a little longer. She quickly hid under her thin blanket, but at the same time, she propped her door shut so that no one could get inside. And at that very moment, she clearly felt the presence of shadows. She clearly heard all their voices, which said that she had to be saved. They wanted only her to survive. Leslie, in turn, quietly said that they should not worry. With tears in her eyes, she told them that she would definitely take revenge for them all. At the same time, the madam hurried to her husband. She shouted that the girl was completely crazy, and without a doubt she had simply gone crazy. She shouted that most likely something happened to the girl when she fell off the cliff. The Marquis asked his wife to calm down. He said that they could easily lock the girl in the room until she woke up again. But Madame was furious. She wanted her husband to look at their daughter, as her behavior had become disgusting. The Marquise screamed that before she couldn't say a word to the servants, but now she used them. She screamed that the girl even built a trap for her nanny. The Marchioness sighed heavily and said that Madame had told her that Leslie had pulled the rope in advance, but it seemed that she had hidden it somewhere, for no one had been able to find it. The Marchioness then said that the young girl's nurse had said that she had used magic on her, for the rope had disappeared, as if by magic. The Marquise was taken aback when he heard this. Madame sighed heavily and said that she thought the girl had only used the rope from the curtains, but the Marquis was taken aback for a moment and thought about it. He was a little worried, as he understood that this simply couldn't be her. Sometime later, he still decided to visit the library in order to confirm his assumptions. He did not know whether several children with powers could be born in a family at once. He wondered whether the power could awaken in the victim. Babies with golden hair and green eyes are destined to reach the top. It is these children who are most likely to awaken their powers. This can be confirmed when the next child is born if the next child does not have silver hair. He will become a sacrifice and his power will be passed on to the firstborn. The Marquis was furious as he had grown up learning such legends, and he wondered if it could all be untrue. He understood that if Leslie's power had awakened, then who would bring glory to their family would be her and not their eldest daughter. He understood that if what had happened recently was dark magic, then that meant that she was strong enough to attack other people. After some thought, he realized that he had to continue planning the wedding of his eldest daughter his son a prince, and he intended to send his youngest daughter to the front lines. He knew that in this case they would receive a dowry from the royal family, as well as rewards during each martial law. He understood that if his eldest daughter could not marry a member of the royal family, then his youngest daughter would be able to solve everything. He rejoiced because he understood that the other marquises were no longer his equal. He was pleased because he knew that the others would do nothing to him, and even the princess would not be able to rise up against him. He wanted to make sure, as quickly as possible, that Leslie had managed to awaken the power. He was a little puzzled, as he didn't know how he should test her strength. But after a few seconds, he was taken aback, as he came across some book. He looked at the book in bewilderment, as he did not understand what it was doing in his library. The Marquise was a little puzzled, as it was, in an ancient language. But after a moment, he froze. He instructed that the children with golden hair had weak magic, so it could hardly be of any use, and did not think about where it could be used if their magic was strong enough to fight. After positive research, they found that if they were thrown into a fire, their power would be transferred to another child with magic. But still, there could be exceptions. If the silver-haired child's strength was 10, then the golden-haired child's strength would only be 8. They didn't know where the other two could have gone. At that moment, the Marquis laughed wildly. At that very moment, he looked into the distance with a predatory grin, as he was sure that the next Lord of Darkness had awakened. The young lady woke up to find her nanny smiling contentedly as she showed her a new outfit that looked lovely. Leslie was a little puzzled and didn't know what had suddenly happened to them all. Recently, a maid greeted her with a joyful smile and offered her delicious and fresh meat for breakfast. The rest of the servants greeted her with joy and asked what she needed. She was a little puzzled to see that everything was very strange. The maid immediately informed the young lady that the dress was a gift from the Marquis. Leslie asked if her sister knew about it, since she usually made scandals. The nanny said that the girl knew about it because she herself gave her dress to her sister, because she is very kind, and at the same time she did not throw a tantrum. Leslie was taken aback for a moment because she knew that this couldn't be true, because her sister would never give her anything of hers. She knew that her sister would rather tear everything apart than share anything. She always mockingly tore her clothes in front of her, which were already too small for her, and then gave them to her. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and said that she was very tired and wanted to sleep. The nanny was shocked, as she had hoped that the girl would get dressed and go out. She shouted to her mistress that she could not just stay in bed, because the Marquise had invited her to dine together. Leslie was very surprised when she heard something like this. Rhea looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she should not call her father a Marquis. Leslie sighed heavily and told the nanny to stop this nonsense. She also asked if the Marquis really wanted to see her. Madame smiled and said that it was exactly like that, because they had not eaten together for a long time. She said that the Marquise also said that there would be a lot of freshly prepared dishes today, which she liked. The young lady in turn turned around and said that she did not want to go anywhere. She said that she did not want to see the Marquise. Madame was taken aback and shouted to her mistress that if she did not come down, she would be punished. She begged her mistress not to be naughty. She shouted that the young lady should be grateful to the Marquise. Looking at the lady, she said that in recent days the Marquise had been very strict with the servants. She sighed heavily as she realized that it was because of the Marquise that the servants were nice to her. She sighed heavily and said that while Leslie was willing to accommodate him, she knew she needed to find out what he was up to. At that very moment, the madam looked at her mistress and asked her to put on an elegant outfit, but the young lady was not going to do anything of the sort. Eli looked at her sister with fury, as she was very upset that her favorite dress was missing, and now her sister caught her eye. She was confused and did not understand why her sister came to the meal. She rushed to her sister and shouted at her to get out slowly. At that very moment, the Marquis entered the room, and looking at his daughter, shouted that this was a disgrace for her. He asked if he really wanted to pull his sister's hair. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She looked at her father with tears in her eyes and wondered if he was mad at her. She screamed with rage that her little sister had taken her place. She cried and screamed that her favorite dishes were dirty. He looked at Leslie closely and asked with a smile if she had slept well, but at the same time, he called her his dear daughter. The young ladies froze in shock, as they did not expect anything like this. The Marquis smiled and asked his daughter why she didn't wear the purple dress, since he gave it to her, because it matched her eyes. He smiled and said that she probably didn't like it, but she shouldn't worry, because her beloved dad would buy her a lot of outfits. Madame froze in shock when she heard her husband's word. Eli looked at her father excitedly and asked if he just gave her her favorite purple dress. She screamed and asked her father if he knew how much she liked the dress. At that very moment, the Marquis looked at his daughter with fury and shouted at her to shut up immediately. He shouted that she needed to be kinder and share with her sister. He said that she had a lot of clothes and she could share. He shouted that she also often suspiciously bullied her sisters. At that very moment, he looked at his wife and said that he was also disappointed in her. He shouted that their daughter was 10 years old and she was very skinny. He did not understand what his wife had been doing all this time. The Marquise was taken aback and asked her husband in surprise what he had just said. He looked at his daughter with a joyful smile and said that she did not need to worry about anything as her father would protect her. Leslie sighed heavily and said that she was not 10 but 12 years old. At that very moment, she asked what he had in mind. The Marquise was taken aback and asked his daughter what she was even talking about. At the same moment, he said that it was his duty as a father to make sure that his daughter was happy. She sighed heavily and said that he never did that, and usually he was the one who yelled at her and hit her and also locked her in her room, and recently he himself left a lot of burns on her. The Marquis was taken aback and said with a timid smile that he was wrong. He said that he understood perfectly well why she did not trust him, since her father suddenly began to show concern. He said that she should understand him the way he did such things because he cared about her. Leslie looked at him with fury and told him not to dare ask her for forgiveness, even though she had no desire to accept his apology. As she left, she looked at him with hatred and said that she would never forgive him. The Marquis was shocked by her words. He shouted for her to stop, as he had already said that it was his fault. The young lady was taken aback and wondered if he had found out about her power. She sighed heavily, as she knew that everything would be fine. She knew that darkness was very difficult to detect because it was not as flashy as magic or the power of light. It hid silently, as if it did not exist at all. It slowly absorbed and then disappeared. Leslie knew that if she didn't use it, no one would know whether she had it or not, but she knew that those who had the same power as hers could sense it. At that very moment, the young lady rushed at her sister and asked in her heart whether she had really told him about everything. Leslie sighed heavily and told her sister that she had not told the Marquis anything like that, and asked her sister if she had really told him everything. Eli asked her sister angrily if she really thought she had gone crazy. Leslie sighed heavily and asked how the Marquis had found out. Then she asked her sister if she was so stupid that she told him everything. The young lady was furious because her sister called her stupid. She raised her hand to her sister, but at that very moment she froze as the shadows enveloped her, and a few seconds later she pushed her sister away. Leslie looked at her sister intently and said that they must try and not interfere with each other recklessly. At the same moment, she turned around and walked quietly to her room while everyone watched her closely. At the same time, the Marquis screamed furiously and threw everything in his path. He was burning with anger and screamed that he had almost bowed before her, but she had not paid any attention to him. He screamed, "Madam," that his daughter should obey him. He wanted to know what the madam knew, but she bowed and trembled with fear, saying that she knew nothing. She was worried and scared because she had a lot of problems because of the young girl. The Marquis shouted at Madame and said that she should have made the girl think only well of him. At that very moment, he rushed towards her and shouted furiously that she must do everything necessary to make his daughter listen to him. He also wanted to know what had been happening to her lately, and in great shock, Madame shouted that she knew something. She said that previously, the young lady was very afraid of fire. The Marquis looked at the maid with a grin. He remembered that day and realized that she was afraid of fire. He wondered if he should take advantage of her fear. The Marquis understood that he had to throw her into the fire again. He understood that she was using her powers to try to survive, and then he would be able to confirm all his suspicions. He wanted to know how great her power was and how much it was worth. But he was puzzled because he did not know how to arrange something like this, because lately she had been very cautious. At that very moment, a servant entered the Marquise's room and informed him that the Marquise wished to discuss something with him regarding the trip to the temple. He looked at the man in surprise. The man said that the day of prayer, which she regularly attended, was the day after tomorrow. The Marquise waved it off and casually said that she should sort everything out herself, as he was very busy. But a moment later, he was thinking about the temple with a predatory grin. Ria looked at the lady intently and said that they were going to the temple today, so she asked her to get dressed quickly. The young lady was a little surprised. Madame asked her mistress if she didn't want to go to the temple. She said that days spent in prayer were extremely important for the family. She also said that the Marquis said that she could go in a separate carriage alone if she wished. Ria spoke of his mistress that the Marquis took great care of her. Leslie sighed heavily and said that she would go. She didn't care where she was. She knew that outside the mansion she could breathe a sigh of relief. Some time later, she sat quietly alone in the carriage. She was a little puzzled, as everything was suspicious, since her father allowed her to travel alone. She felt calm, since without the Marquise and the maid, it was really calm. Leslie thought for a moment about how many long and painful years she had lived in the mansion. She knew that several days had already passed, but she already wanted to return to the princess as soon as possible. At the same time, the Marquise and his family were riding quietly in a carriage, but suddenly their carriage stopped. The young lady looked at her father in bewilderment. He quietly passed a small note to some men. The Marquise looked in surprise at her husband and the crowd of men. She was puzzled because she did not know what was happening, but the Marquis said that nothing of the sort had happened, and now they should return home. The Marquise was surprised since they were heading to the temple. The Marquis said that nothing would happen if they missed one day of prayer. The Marquise was furious. She wanted her husband to explain what was going on. She did not understand why he behaved this way and constantly hung around their youngest daughter. And now he suddenly canceled the trip to the temple. She wanted to know why he called the men and why they had axes in their hands. He waved it off and said that she didn't need to worry, since he did everything not only for his own benefit, but for the sake of his family. He sighed heavily and said that the axes were just a precaution in case of fire, and he immediately assured his wife that there was no need to worry. Looking at his wife, he said that he was doing all this for her and for their beloved daughter. Eli was momentarily taken aback when she heard her father talk about the fire. She remembered how her sister got into the dirty carriage alone. She was in shock and understood that this was not a question. The Marquise looked closely at her daughter and asked if she had already said something. The young lady smiled and said that she had simply misheard. In turn, she was very nervous, as she was worried that something irreparable might happen. At the same time, the young lady was riding in the carriage, carefree and quiet. She hoped that the month would fly by quickly. She wondered if she should have prayed in the temple today to make the time go faster. She smiled tenderly because she knew that everyone called the princess a monster, but she could not find a place because she was not nearby. At that very moment, the young lady looked out the window with excitement as the carriage suddenly stopped. She was taken aback and wondered if they were really going to the temple, since the road seemed unfamiliar to her. She asked the coachman for forgiveness and asked if something had happened. At that moment, the young lady was taken aback as she knocked, but no one answered. She was frightened because in response, she received only dead silence. At the same moment, she tried to open the door, but it was all in vain. Leslie was very scared and worried because she pulled the door, but it did not open. And at that very moment, she heard some kind of crash outside the door. She realized that everything was very strange, and she realized that something was wrong. She realized that she could get out through the window. But at that very moment, she shuddered as the carriage caught fire. She was very scared because she saw fire around her and remembered what happened recently. She was very scared and confused. She didn't know what to do. At that very moment, she made a decision because she had to use her power. She wanted to do everything to survive. But after a few seconds, she heard some kind of rumble. At that very moment, she heard a man's voice and realized that he was from the Marquise's estate. She was shocked since everything was deliberately set up by Marxism so that she would show her powers. Leslie was furious and did not understand how long he would continue to poison her life. She felt sick at that very moment and began to choke on the acrid smoke. She realized that she should not use force, but she also understood that she would soon die. She sighed heavily because she did not want to die at all, and at that very moment, she decided that the darkness should swallow everything in its path. She realized that this was the right decision and decided to destroy everything around. But at that very moment, she recoiled and looked at the door in horror as she heard some kind of terrible roar. She heard the door creak and saw a young man. She did not understand who was in front of her, since there was a veil of smoke before her eyes. But she clearly saw that the young man was reaching out to her. At that very moment, she began to cry and saw her new big brother in front of her. He quickly grabbed her and pulled her towards him. A few minutes later, he pulled her out of the burning carriage. Everyone looked at him with concern as he had acted very riskily. The knights asked their captain if he was okay. The young men ran up to the captain and said that they understood that the girl was in great danger, but that tearing the door off its hinges with bare hands was very dangerous. Some time ago, a young lady approached the knights and called them in a hurry. She looked away from them and said that there was a burning carriage on the road to the temple. The young man looked intently at the girl and asked how she knew such a thing. She was taken aback and shouted that she had found out by accident. She did not understand why it mattered to them where she had found out such information, because now it was more important that the carriage was on fire. She shouted that they had to quickly save the child before she used her power. The young man looked at her in surprise as she spoke about the child and about strength. But the young lady had no intention of answering them and simply ran away. They shouted that she should at least say which road the carriage was on. But she did not answer them and quickly hid around the corner. But at the same time, the young man noticed her golden hair. He stood frozen for a moment, considering her words carefully. Betrian knew perfectly well that it didn't look like an accident, and he assumed that someone had deliberately planned the murders. He didn't know who could have planned something like this, and so he hugged the young girl tighter, protecting her in this way. He sighed heavily and looked intently at the burning carriage. A moment later, some men approached the young man and thanked him for saving their mistress. The man said that they did not know who he was, but they would certainly send him a letter of thanks. He looked intently at the young man and asked him to give their mistress to them. Betrian in turn gave the young lady to his subordinate. A few seconds later, he walked up to the man and grabbed his throat with fury. He looked at him with fury and said that it was very interesting. He saw that it was very cold today, but there was not a drop of sweat on the man, and on the contrary, he was even a little frozen. He looked closely at all the men present and said that it seemed to him as if they had known from the very beginning that the carriage would burn. He looked at the men with fury and asked if it was true. The man was taken aback and shouted at the young man to let him go. Betrian casually pushed the man away, and he fell to the ground with a roar. The man shouted angrily at the young man that he and all the other knights had no business being in that place. He shouted that they had just happened to take the axes just in case the knights were furious, and shouted that it was no accident. They knew that, by chance, the door would not have been blocked by logs. And what's more, the door was latched. The men backed away, not knowing what to answer, as they were cornered. At that very moment, a man with an axe on the livestock rushed towards the young man and shouted that it made no difference what had happened, and they must immediately give them back their mistress. Betrian looked closely at the men and introduced himself at the same moment. The man backed away and accidentally threw away the axe out of fear. He did not expect to see the squad leader in front of him. Betrian looked at the man with anger and said that he called his knights kidnappers. He asked the man if he could answer for his words. The knights were furious and did not understand how the man dared to insult them in such a way. They wanted him to immediately call out the name of his master. But at that very moment, the men rushed into the forest as they understood that inevitable death awaited them. The knight sighed heavily and asked his captain if they should catch up with the fugitives. But the captain said that they did not need to do that. The knight looked at his captain with a worried expression and asked if he knew whose child it was. He sighed heavily and said that he knew, because it was his sister. At the same time, the young lady was running away from the wild flames in a hurry. She screamed and called for someone to help, but it was all in vain as the flames were consuming her. Moments later, she woke up screaming and with tears in her eyes. She was puzzled and worried because she did not know where she was. She remembered that someone had come to save her. At that very moment, she clearly heard the princess's voice. She looked intently at Madame and said that Betrion saved her. The princess smiled and said that everything was true and her son saved her. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she was not seriously injured, but she had several burns, so she called a priest to heal her. At that very moment, the princess gave the young lady some medicine, since all she needed now was sleep and rest. The young lady took the medicine and began to drink it, but felt a very bitter taste. At that moment, the princess smiled and gave the young lady a sweet candy. Leslie sighed heavily and said that she needed to thank her savior. The princess looked at the girl with a smile and said that she would convey her gratitude to him, so she should now lie down and sleep. The young lady was frightened, because she knew that if she fell asleep now, she would soon see that terrible dream. She timidly looked at the princess and asked if a contract had been concluded between them. Leslie was very keen for the princess to be by her side until she fell asleep. Madame smiled and said that a contract had been concluded between them. Leslie smiled and said that she understood everything, and she was very glad because she read in the book that a contract is a promise that must be kept, and on the basis of what is promised, it is also necessary to conclude a contract. The princess looked closely at the girl because she understood why this tiny child was trying so hard to reach them to offer her a contract. Leslie looked at Madame with a keen gaze and asked if the princess would always be on her side. She asked if the princess should throw her into the fire. Madame was taken aback and said that, of course, she would not do anything like that, and according to their contract, she would always be on her side. She looked at the girl tenderly and said that she needed to rest, and for this reason, she would be next to her until she fell asleep. The young lady closed her eyes with a smile as she felt a warm hand, Madame. After some time, the madam left the young lady's room. She saw her son and asked what was wrong with his hand. He sighed heavily and said that the priest examined it immediately, and all the wounds were healed. She said with a smile that he was a good boy. At that very moment, she became very angry, because she realized that the Marquise had crossed the line. Betrion sighed heavily and said that it seemed that the Marquise had gone out of his mind. He would never have thought that the Marquis was capable of setting fire to the carriage where his daughter was. He was puzzled and did not understand why the Marquise would do such a thing. The princess sighed heavily and said that she did not know for sure, but she remembered that her relatives had told her before that the second sons and daughters of the Marquis' family most often died early, rather than in the usual way. Betrion looked at his mother in surprise, as he didn't remember anything like that. She sighed heavily and said that there hadn't been many deaths lately, and after all, grandfather had said that all of this was long in the past. And besides, they usually didn't have to be interested in the affairs of other families. She understood that she needed to visit the Marquise. At the same time, the young lady threw away the cloak in horror and looked at it intently. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had made the right choice. She knew she had done the right thing and had thus saved her sisters. She knew she had done a good job, but she was still a little puzzled. At that very moment, a maid burst into her room and hurriedly told her that there was a commotion downstairs. She said that the Marquis was now furious, and he began to smash the whole house. At that very moment, the young lady quickly went downstairs and heard a rumble and noise. He was furious and didn't understand where his daughter had gone. At that very moment, the man informed the Marquis that the young lady had been taken away by the knights of the princely family. The young lady was taken aback when she heard about the princess. She realized that if the matter was related to the princess, then her father would not be able to deal with her. She was puzzled because she realized that her sister had chosen the princess and turned to her for help. She hoped that no problems would arise in the future. She understood that her sister would not even try to return home. The young lady was very afraid that if her sister came back, her parents would love her more. She was afraid that in that case, she would become a victim for her sister. At that very moment, she couldn't bear it any longer and screamed. She understood that her sister should never return home, as it was beneficial for both of them. At that very moment, the man announced that the princess had come to visit them. The young lady was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing. She realized that it was the princess who had taken her sister. The butler said that he did not know why she had come, and he was simply told that she wanted to speak with the Marquise. At that very moment, her lady entered the room in a hurry. She froze in place when she saw the princess in all her beauty. At that very moment, the young lady bowed and greeted the princess. Madame looked at her with a smile and said that she was very glad to meet her. Eli was taken aback and looked at the princess with bewilderment, since she did not understand why she was enormous. At that very moment, the princess with a smile asked for forgiveness and asked the young lady how old she was. Eli was taken aback and looked at the madam with bewilderment, but at that very moment she said that she was 15 years old. She looked at Madame in surprise and wondered if she had come to them only out of curiosity. The princess looked at the girl with a smile and said that she was quite big for her age. Some time later, the Marquis entered the room and asked the princess's forgiveness for keeping her waiting. He smiled and said that it seemed that she had come to him about the incident with his daughter. He also said with a smile that their carriage was far away, so he did not have the chance to find out about what had happened. He told the princess that she had helped him a lot, and he also apologized very much for wasting her time. The princess looked at him intently as she realized that he was lying. He said that he learned about this incident from the reviews of his servant. He ran to because he was afraid of the burning carriage, but he was glad that her knights came to the rescue. He sighed and said that he had warned them to be careful with fire. Looking at the madam, he said that he would definitely teach them a lesson, and he also asked for forgiveness on behalf of his subordinates. At that very moment, he said that he would like to know the whereabouts of his daughter, but the princess did not let him finish and asked if she was really his daughter. The Marquise was angry with this question, but a moment later, he said with a smile that of course the girl was his daughter. He said that she was his second child. The princess sighed heavily and said that she had not seen the family coat of arms on her carriage. He said that he had hurried and given her a smaller carriage because she did not want to ride in the same one as them. He told the princess with a smile that she had several sons, and at that age they began to rebel. He sighed heavily and said that she chose her own carriage since she was a little stubborn. Looking at the princess, he said that the child was not at all interested in elegant carriages. She looked at him intently and said that instead, her choice was the smallest, most inconspicuous, and oily carriage. The Marquis looked at her angrily, but said nothing. She smiled and said that he had a simply wonderful daughter, a daughter of whom he was so wonderfully proud, and that was Eli's. The princess said that the young lady came out and greeted her while she was waiting for him. And while the young lady showed her the whole mansion while he was gone, she said with a smile that, unlike her house, his estate looked like a palace. He said with a smile that their mansion really had a rich history. The Marquise sighed heavily and asked if it wasn't strange. She was talking about this child's room in this huge mansion. He looked at her with bewilderment as he did not understand what was being discussed. She smiled and said that, of course, the Marks were always here in his palace, but he loved his children so much, and this could be called a rarity, since she was quite surprised when she heard that he bought an entire clothing store for his daughter. She smiled and said that she thought she was right from the dressing room to the library. However, for the other child, he did nothing at all. She looked intently at the Marquis and said that she had examined the entire mansion and found traces of only one daughter's residence. The Marquis looked at her with fury and asked what she was getting at. She looked closely at the Marquis and asked if he had raised his youngest daughter for any other purposes. He looked at her with fury and said that he had no idea where she heard such a thing. The princess said that her grandfather told her when she was still a child, and he said something about how often the younger children died at an early age, and it was quite strange, and yet they all had silver hair. The Marquis looked at her angrily and asked what she meant by that. He wanted to know how much she knew. She sighed heavily and said that she knew nothing since the princess understood that it was very risky. She wasn't sure if all the children had silver hair, but she decided to put all the facts together anyway. She understood that even if he did not admit his cruel intent, she would do it since she wanted to protect her. But Julia is a lady. The princess looked at him menacingly and said that she knew for sure that he was raising the young lady not as a daughter, but for something else. She also mentioned that he had tried to kill her many times. The Marquis was taken aback and shouted that the girl was his daughter, and she belonged to her parents, so he had the right and could do with her whatever he wanted. The princess sighed heavily and told him not to say such terrible things. He shouted that if she did not immediately return his daughter to him, he would take his knights and storm the estate, and after that he would challenge her to a duel and kill her. The princess immediately pushed the marquise and said that he could do whatever he wanted. At that very moment, he closed his eyes, but after a few seconds, he opened them and became numb. He was shocked and very afraid as the princess was advancing on him. At that very moment, she used her power and broke the beautiful chair. She looked at him with a smirk and said that she was sure that he would have a great time when the duel took place, because she intended to personally break all his bones with her own bare hands. As she left, she said with a grin that she would count every minute until that day. The marquise was furious. He shouted that he would sue her and would certainly tell the emperor everything, since he intended to return everything that rightfully belonged to him. She sighed heavily and said with a grin that it would be a very funny sight. After some time, the young lady woke up and froze for a moment, as she did not know what had happened at all. She remembered how the fire was burning and a shudder ran through her. She understood that it was just a dream because she was alive. At that very moment, she remembered everything that had happened and froze in place in embarrassment, since she understood that she was no longer a child, but she still asked the princess to sit next to her until she fell asleep. She was a little puzzled since she did not remember their conversation in detail. At that very moment, she heard a knock on the door and the voice of a young man. She heard the conversation and decided to quickly pretend to be asleep. A moment later, she closed her eyes but clearly heard the door creak. The young man looked closely at the girl and noticed that she was still sleeping. The man came closer to her and said with a smile that she had very small closed eyes. She was taken aback because she did not know who was in front of her. The man sighed heavily and said that she must have been terrible, frightened by everything that had happened. He was furious because he knew the marquise was just crazy. He shouted that when the marquise was on the battlefield, he would pretend to be mistaken and give him a good beating. Betrion sighed heavily and said that even if chaos broke out on the battlefield, the knights and mercenaries would come out, not him. At that very moment, the young lady heard a man's voice and was taken aback, and the man looked at her with a joyful smile as he noticed that she had woken up. Leslie was frightened and quickly pulled herself into her friend's arms. Betrion hugged the young lady and calmed her down, and at that very moment he informed her that nothing would happen to her, since his father was now in front of her. The man backed away and asked if his face was really that scary. At that very moment, he hid his face with his hands and asked if it was better this way. After a few seconds, he hid under his cloak and asked if it was better this way. She looked at him in surprise, as she thought he looked like a bear. At that very moment, they looked at her in surprise as she laughed. Leslie walked up to the man and looked at him intently, as she knew no adult had ever tried to please her. She came closer to him and, bowing, greeted him and introduced herself. She was not afraid of him, but she saw that he was simply enormous in size. But at the same time, she saw his face shining with happiness. Serain looked closely at the young lady and introduced himself with a smile. He gave her his radiant smile and welcomed her into their home. She looked at him with a tender smile. Some time later, the young lady was happily eating, surrounded by handsome men. Serain looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and said that she was eating very well, although he noted that it would be much better if she had something more nutritious for breakfast. He said with a smile that it was a little late, but he was sure that a couple of pieces of meat would not hurt her. But at that very moment, the madame stopped him and said that it was not advisable to feed the young lady heavy food. He hung up and said that when they were wounded, they ate meat and everything was fine. Jenna looked at the gentleman intently and told him not to forget that the young lady was a common person. Leslie smiled and, looking at the man, said that the food was very tasty and he did not need to worry. He stood up at that very moment and asked if she wanted him to bring her another omelet. The young man looked at his father and stopped him. Cyrene sighed heavily and asked what he had done wrong, as he simply wanted to feed the child who had slept for 4 days straight. Some good food? Betrion said that the girl should eat light food and not strain herself. But Leslie was surprised that she had slept for so long. She sighed heavily, as it was now no wonder that she felt so weak. She excitedly asked everyone present if there had been any problems with the Marquis over the past few days. She understood that he could not sit idly by. She knew that the Marquis would go but anything for his own purpose. She understood that she could only guess what he intended to arrange in order to bring her back to the family. But at the same moment, they assured her that there were no problems. Seyran said, with a satisfied smile, that his beautiful wife had interrupted everyone, but he had not expressed himself very culturally. Madame was shocked that her master had expressed himself in such a way. The young lady looked at the man in bewilderment, as she did not understand what his words meant. She knew this place was different from her old home, so she wouldn't get into trouble if she asked. At that very moment, she asked forgiveness from everyone present, and asked what these words meant. But when she repeated them, everyone present froze in place. Seyrain was taken aback, and at that very moment he said that she had broken their backs. But Madame still closed the gentleman's mouth, and he did not have time to finish. The young lady looked closely at her new brother, and asked if the gentleman's words meant that the princess had broken their spine, since she knew that the spine was the neck. The young man sighed heavily, and covered her ears, so that she would not hear anything like that again. At that very moment, they removed the master from the dining room. He was shocked and shouted that he would be careful with his words from now on. Betrian looked intently at the young lady and asked her to forget such nasty words. He sighed heavily and said that his father had previously been a mercenary, so he could say bad words from time to time. She sighed heavily and remembered all his words, but she was interested in how he managed to marry the princess. She looked intently at the young man, asking if the princess had really broken the Marquis's neck. The young man had to say that of course it was not so. Betrian sighed heavily and said that he had to explain everything to her from the very beginning. He said that the Marquis had come to them in a hurry to pick her up. But before this, the princess paid him a visit. And it seems that because of this, the Marquis was convinced that he would not be able to take his daughter back, so he raised a noise at the main gate shouting at them to give up his daughter. He even brought in professional kidnappers from the guild. When they arrived, the princess was home alone, so they had no lack of confidence. At that moment, she easily opened the main gate, as she wanted to talk to them, as unfortunately for them, they had attacked the wrong one. She easily dealt with everyone, and after some time managed to grab the Marquis. She looked at the Marquis with fury and said that if he tried to do something like that again, then next time she would break his neck instead of his arm. Betrian looked closely at the young lady, and sighing heavily, said that this is exactly how it was. But she dropped the spoon in shock. Leslie froze in shock. She couldn't believe that the princess had broken the Marquis's arm with her own hands. Seyrain said with a satisfied grin that the Marquis had gotten involved with his wife without knowing about her strength, and he called the Marquis an idiot. Leslie froze in shock as he had called the Marquis an idiot. And earlier the Marquis had seemed huge, strong, and scary to her. When she still lived under the Marquis's roof, he was someone she would never have been able to cope with. Betrian quickly closed his father's eyes on the other side, and despite his tears, he said that his mother hated it when the estate became too noisy. The young lady in turn laughed. Betrian sighed heavily but did not answer. A few seconds later, he handed her a spoon and told her that she needed to eat and take her medicine before returning to rest. After some time, she entered a spacious and lively room. She looked intently at everyone present and said that the room was truly wonderful, and the man in turn could not contain his happiness. A moment later, a maid entered the Nivk room. Jenna looked at the maid with a smile and said that she would now take care of her. Maidel bowed to the young lady with a smile and said that she would now work with hers. Seyrain looked closely at his wife while he helped her undress. He sighed heavily because he knew that she had been exhausted all day, messing around with all sorts of merismatics. He sat her down on a chair with a gentle smile and began pouring tea. She looked at him closely and said with a smile that it seemed like he had talked to Leslie. He said with a satisfied smile that this was true, and her sweetness was simply indescribable. He did not understand how such a sweet and tiny miracle could even exist. Seyran sighed heavily and said with a smile that he did not know how to behave with her because he was used to chatting with his sons, and now in front of him was a little tiny girl who was smiling a very sweet smile. He looked at her intently and joyfully asked if she would definitely be their daughter. The princess smiled and said that, of course, she would be their daughter, and they would not have any difficulties with adoption. He glared at her so angry that the Marquise was causing trouble. She sighed heavily and said that he was quickly erasing all evidence of the abuse against Leslie, and since the evidence was hidden in their house, there was little she could do, and there was no evidence outside since he did not allow her to leave the mansion. She sighed heavily and said that he was probably currently working on this case, since he was preparing to summon her to court. Serene sighed heavily and asked his wife if she could ask the imperial family to send him to the front lines in the thick of battle for just one day. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding why she had to do that. He grinned predatorily and said that he wanted to accidentally break his neck. He said that he would polish his axe until it shined, and then he would deal with it. At that very moment, she smiled sweetly and called her husband. The princess also asked her husband to be a little careful in his expressions around Leslie, since she still clearly remembered how their son swore in front of the imperial family. The next day, the princess greeted the young lady with a joyful smile. Leslie greeted the princess with a smile. She noticed that Madame looked a little tired, but she also noticed that everyone was greeting each other happily. Leslie was a little puzzled, as she did not know where she could sit. At that very moment, Betrian Rybkoi called the young lady. She thanked her new brother as he put several pillows under her so that she could sit more comfortably. They discussed her outfits for a while, and what they should do. Leslie was taken aback and looked at them in surprise. At that very moment, she said that it was not at all necessary to buy her a chair, because she could continue sitting like that. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really worried about money or something like that. Leslie smiled and said that it was because she was going to eat everything on her plate and grow up fast, so buying a small chair was a waste of money. The princess smiled and said that everything was fine, because she knew that the girl needed to be comfortable, and later other children could use this chair. She also said that she had already invited the dressmaker, and they needed to look at the catalog of outfits and fabrics. Said Syed that he should go to Mormon, as he had the best selection of furniture. The young lady looked at everyone present and asked if she could go downtown, as she had never been there. The princess looked at the girl with a smile and said that of course she could do it, and she should go and take a walk. She looked closely at her son and told him to join the young lady. The young lady looked closely at her brother, as she assumed that he had some plans with his knights. He sighed heavily and said that it would be nice to take a day off. Once Serene, in turn, shouted that he wanted to go too. The princess told her husband that he had a lot of documents left that he had to sort out. The man sighed heavily as he just remembered this. Leslie looked at them with a smile, as she was pleased with this atmosphere. Betrion walked slowly through the estate with the young lady, but at that very moment he noticed guests outside. He lifted the young lady with ease. Leslie was taken aback because it was very high. Betrion sighed heavily and said that in the distance stood Ruenti, who would be her older brother. Leslie asked in surprise who was next to him. She looked closely, as she had seen the young man somewhere. Betrion said that next to his brother stood Conrad Alpa Ultra, the prince's eldest son. The young lady looked intently at the young man, but at that very moment, the young man turned around and looked up. She was taken aback when she saw golden eyes. Leslie remembered how he was the one who helped her at church. Leslie looked at her brother in surprise and asked if the Alter and Salvatore families didn't have a strained relationship. The power structure in the empire was divided into four main forces: the imperial family, the Alter family, which had royal blood, the Salvator family, and the three marquises. And she had also read that one of the princes supported the imperial family, while the other supported the other. Betrion looked closely at the young lady and said that not everything written in books always corresponds to reality. She sighed heavily as she realized that even in the books there were lies. Leslie said that she heard that the Alter family had strong magic. The young man said that it didn't seem like the Salvator family's ability, but it was true. Their family often had children with strong magic. He said that the member of the Alter family they had just seen was one of the knights of the church. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was not a priest but a paladin. He said that when someone becomes a priest, they have to renounce their name. However, since the Altera are fine swordsmen, they don't have to be priests. She looked intently out the window and thought that most likely they had entered the mansion. Betrian said that now they could return to my room and later go to the city center. But after a few seconds, they heard the voice of a young man. Ruenti looked at his brother in bewilderment as he held the young girl in his arms. He looked at his brother with surprise and indignation and asked what was that in his hands. Betrian quickly walked up to his brother and hit him on the head. The young man was puzzled and did not understand why his brother did this to him. Betrian sighed heavily and told his brother to mind his manners. The young man made a mistake again, and at that very moment, he got it again. Ruenti was shocked because he didn't expect anything like this. At that very moment, her lady looked at the boy who was smiling at her with his tenderness. She felt very awkward, and so she hid. Betrian looked intently at the young man and asked if he had come on a church mission. The young man smiled and said that it was so, and he had brought things from the temple for the princess. He smiled and said that he was about to leave, but he noticed that they had a wonderful guest. He looked at the young lady with a smile and introduced himself. At that very moment, he asked with a smile if he could know the name of the beautiful lady. She timidly said that her name was Leslie. She knew perfectly well that it was very rude not to say her full name, but she did not want to say that she was Leslie Sperato, because she wanted to say with pride that she was Leslie Salvatore. He smiled and said that she had a very beautiful name. Conrad Alp said with a smile that it was time for him to leave, and he hoped that they would meet again in their temple. Leslie stared after him but said nothing. At that very moment, the young man again asked his brother what it was that he had in his hands. But after a few seconds, he was taken aback as he saw that his brother was aiming at him again. He asked his brother who he had in his arms. Betrian in turn sighed heavily, and a moment later, he said that this was their younger sister. The young man froze for a moment in shock. Some time later, the young lady was sitting in the dining room, enjoying delicious pancakes. She was glad that she could enjoy such a thing, but she felt somehow lonely and awkward in the spacious dining room alone. But he promised that he would take her to the city tomorrow. Leslie decided to put all her thoughts aside more easily, since she knew that she shouldn't be lonely. After all, she hadn't been officially adopted yet, and besides, she was in the estate simply under a contract. She understood that she had entered into a contract with the princess for the sake of survival, and not in order to become her daughter. She was a little confused because everyone in the estate was too kind to her, and she even wanted to act nice as she wanted to be their real daughter. Leslie sighed heavily as she realized she shouldn't think about that. She knew that Betrian had promised to take her to the city tomorrow, but she was a little puzzled and looked closely at her finger, as she did not understand what they did with their fingers then. At that very moment, she looked intently at her hands, but a moment later, she felt someone's presence behind her. Ruenti looked casually at the young lady and asked who she was. Leslie looked at him intently and did not answer, but after a few seconds, she said her name was Leslie Sperato. He looked at her with disdain. He sighed heavily and said that he knew the mother was going to adopt the child because of that day. He looked at her with fury and asked why there was a child from the Sperato family in their house. He was taken aback, as he had not meant to shout so loudly. The young man understood that the young lady would most likely cry, since the guy in front of her was a terrible guy after all. Before this, he had glared at her, shouted, and even hit the table, so he assumed that he had gone too far. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that it was all because she asked the princess to adopt her and offered her a deal which she agreed to. Ruenti froze in place with a puzzled look on his face. The young man was taken aback and wondered if he had heard correctly that she had offered her a deal. He was shocked and did not understand that the young lady had asked his mother for such a thing. Leslie looked at the young man closely and said that the princess had not told her whether she could talk about it, so the only thing she could say was that she would soon become the princess's daughter. He understood that she was not at all fearless, because it was written on her face that she was used to this kind of thing. He understood that she was used to anger, oppression, ridicule, contempt. He was shocked because she was used to dealing with such emotions. Ruenti was puzzled and could not answer, while the young lady bowed politely and left. Ruenti was shocked and did not understand what was wrong with the girl. He did not understand why his mother invited Sperato's child for such an important thing. He was in shock. He didn't understand what he was even thinking about his mother. She sighed heavily and asked the maid what it meant when people hooked their fingers together. The maid looked at the girl in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Leslie looked at the maid intently and said that Betrion had hooked his finger through hers. The maid looked at her with a smile and asked if it was true. She asked the lady if she meant that they had crossed their fingers because he couldn't take her into town. At that moment, she asked the maid with a smile if she could ask something else. Medel smiled, looking at the lady, and said that if she had any questions, she could ask them. Leslie asked what the difference was between a contract and crossing her fingers, because these methods are needed for important promises. Medel thought for a moment and said that a contract is something that is usually concluded and signed by adults, but it is mostly children who cross their fingers. Leslie beamed with happiness and thanked the maid for explaining everything so clearly. Leslie looked at the maid intently and asked if she could look outside for a little while longer, since it was going to snow soon. The maid was taken aback because she realized that she had lost to her mistress, and with a smile, she said that in that case, she would bring her a cup of hot chocolate. Leslie looked at the maid in surprise, as she had never tried anything like this before. Medel said with a smile that she would bring hot chocolate with marshmallows and make it very sweet. She was sure that the mistress would appreciate the wonderful drink. At that very moment, the young lady asked her maid what hot chocolate was. Medel froze in shock, as she didn't expect such a question. Madel, with lightning speed, began to tell the lady what hot chocolate is. The maid told the mistress that when she had drunk the wonderful drink and she could go outside for a little walk, the young lady beamed with happiness. And at that very moment, she said about her maid that she could drink hot chocolate with her there. Medel, in turn, hurried to the kitchen, as she wanted to prepare a wonderful drink for the lady. But there she bumped into Jenna. The princess looked at the maid and asked how the young lady was doing. The maid hesitated, not knowing what to answer. But at that very moment, she sighed heavily and said that the young lady was a little strange. She sighed heavily and said that the young lady didn't know what crossing her fingers meant, and she also didn't know what hot chocolate was. And today, she overheard conversations in the kitchen, and it seemed that when they gave the young lady pancakes, they heard her say that the dish was very beautiful, and she had never eaten such beautiful food before. Madel said the young lady acted mature and often used complex words in conversation. But when the elder lord said that he could not take her into the city, she smiled and said that everything was fine. Madel sighed heavily, and looking at the lady said that most children her age did not behave like this, and every time she ate, her face shone like that of a normal child. The princess sighed heavily and said that the young lady had her reasons for this. She looked closely at the maid and asked her to take good care of the young lady. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly near the window and closely watched the night sky. Madel returned after some time and noticed that the young lady was sleeping quietly, hugging a pillow. She quietly carried the young lady to the bed and wished her good night. The next day, the maid was excited, looked at her mistress, and asked, since when she was sitting near the window. Leslie smiled and said that she did not know how she woke up, and immediately went to the window. The young maid was very worried about her mistress, as she could simply freeze and catch a cold there. But the young lady assured her maid that she was fine. Leslie smiled and told the maid that she was fine, and that she would like to go downtown as soon as possible. She asked the maid if she could help her get ready. Some time later, the young lady happily greeted her brother. He was taken aback for a moment and looked in surprise at the small fur ball. At that moment, the young man lifted it with his ease. The maid smiled and said that this fur coat belonged to Ruenti when he was little, and it was the smallest garment they could find. The young lady in turn felt shocked, since the young man had worn a beautiful fur coat when he was younger than her, and this fur coat was very big for her now. Betrion looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she should not be upset since she was a girl, so she was smaller than them. Jenna looked at the young gentleman intently and said that girls at her age were usually taller than boys, so he should shut up and keep quiet to avoid causing trouble. He looked at his companion with a smile and said that she would grow up soon. He said that his brother was also small, but he ate a lot of meat, so he grew up quickly, and she could too. Leslie looked closely at the young man and asked if she could be as tall as the princess. Betrion looked intently at the young lady and said that anything was possible. He smiled tenderly as he looked at her and said that perhaps she would become like his mother. At that very moment, the young lady beamed with happiness. Some time later, they were riding leisurely into the city, and the young lady was looking intently at the beautiful streets. She said with a smile that, looking out the window, made it easier for her to breathe. The young people froze for a moment and felt awkward after her words. The maid looked at her friend and said that hot chocolate was very expensive and they should only drink it once a month. Medell said that she should have given it to her mistress. She sighed heavily and said that she felt very sorry for her. Her friend said that the young girl was a little different from other noble ladies, as she remembered the situation with the pancakes. Madel sighed heavily and said that she had told the princess everything. The girl froze in shock and immediately put down her cup. She looked closely at her friend and asked if she was okay. Medel sighed heavily as she felt like she could hear her friend's thoughts. They knew perfectly well that the main rule for the servants of the mansion was to remain silent and speak only on business. The princess despised loud and dirty things. She could get rid of anything that irritated her. Their family was so terrifying that it made your blood run cold. Meadle smiled and told her friend that she was okay. She also said that the princess asked her to take care of her mistress. The young maid was shocked by the statement, but still knew that they had to try to do it. Madel looked closely at the young lady and said that they would arrive shortly, but she noticed that the lady was most likely hungry, and they should have breakfast earlier. She said with a smile that they could have some hot chocolate, which she hadn't had yesterday. At that moment, the young lady beamed with happiness. Medell, with a smile, said that she knew the best restaurants in town, so they could have some hot chocolate before they went shopping for clothes. After some time, they entered a beautiful and spacious establishment. She said that the young lady would need shirts, trousers, and gloves, as well as pajamas. The man was taken aback for a moment. He sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that they had shirts and trousers for boys, but they had nothing for a girl of that size. However, they did have a few ready-made outfits in stock. Medell looked closely at the man and said that you first showed them everything they had, and then they would decide on the size. Betrion looked at the maid in surprise as she said they needed shirts and trousers. The girl smiled and said that the butler had asked her to order several pairs of trousers and shirts for the young lady. Betrion looked closely at the girl and said that it looked like his mother was going to teach her. Leslie was surprised by such a statement. Betrion looked at the young lady and said that health is very important, and at the same time, he began to feed her cookies. Some time later, the young lady also happily tried on different outfits. She was very happy and liked everything. The man said with a smile that it was the best dress in their store, and he was very glad that she liked it. A moment later, he showed the maid a catalog where the most elegant dresses were listed first. At that very moment, the young lady asked the young man to take her to the dressing room. A few minutes later, the young man led the young lady into the restroom and told her where to go next. She looked at him intently and thanked him with a smile. After some time, she slowly walked to the restroom. But a moment later, someone suddenly grabbed her. She was taken aback and froze in shock when she saw her sister, who was burning with rage and anger. Leslie looked at her sister in surprise and asked what she was doing in a store like that. Eli looked around with fury and told her sister that she should be the one asking why she was in such an expensive store. A moment later, she pushed her sister around the corner. Eli pushed her little sister into the wall, and she hit her head very painfully. Eli glared at her sister and said that the boutique was known for being exclusive to certain families. She scornfully told her sister that since she had been to that boutique, it must be having financial difficulties. She said that in that case, she would have to go to another store next time, namely, some elegant one where they understand how good the customer looks. Leslie looked closely at her sister and said that she was angry not because the store was expensive and accessible only to a few, but because someone like her dared to go into the same boutique with her. When Leslie previously lived in the same mansion with her sister, Eli never allowed her to go near her room. However, she noticed that her sister came to the store alone early in the morning, so she asked her sister if the Marquise was not doing well. Leslie knew that usually her sister would go into town later and spend the day leisurely or ask the designers to bring a catalog to the mansion so that she could buy something. She understood why her sister acted this way, because rumors about how they could have made a fuss in front of the princess and broken his arm were already spreading. She realized that her sister had arrived so early since there were few people in the boutique. Eli was shocked and asked her sister if she knew about everything. Leslie looked at her sister in surprise, but she shouted that she had planned it all. Eli screamed at her sister that she had told everything about the princess and asked her to break their father's arm. She screamed that Leslie had done it on purpose to shame her and take revenge. Leslie sighed heavily as she saw that her sister had not changed a bit. She knew that her sister never admitted her mistakes and blamed her for all her troubles. Eli was very excited and said quietly that she simply asked the Salvatores to help her. Leslie looked at her sister in bewilderment as she did not understand what she was talking about. Leslie sighed heavily as she realized that everything was right. And in a sense, she had helped her. After all, if she had not been abandoned, that fire for her sister, then she might have spent her whole life in the Sparado family, dreaming of their love. Believing all this time that she was simply useless, she understood perfectly well that everything was thanks to her sister. Leslie looked at her sister in surprise, as she did not understand why she had to do this. Eli screamed furiously at her sister that it was all because of her. She asked her sister if she knew what suffering their parents were going through now because of her. She screamed that their mother doesn't even leave the room to eat. Leslie casually asked what she got out of it. The young lady was furious and asked her sister if she didn't care about their mother's health. At that very moment, Leslie removed her hand and clutched her grip and said with fury that she was starved, every day mocked and starved for days on end. She was not allowed to leave the house, and thanks to some people, she was not allowed to be in certain parts of the mansion. She looked at her sister with fury and said that she didn't really care about the Marquise, and even sister. Eli couldn't take it anymore and angrily shouted at her sister that it was all her fault and that she was born useless. She was angry because she understood that no one asked her to be born with such white hair. She asked with fury who asked her to be born with the fate of the victim. Eli screamed at her sister that she could have been loved if she had been born with golden hair and green eyes just like hers. Leslie, leaving, sighed heavily and asked her sister if she had been born the same way. Would she ask her to share the power that she also expected? Leslie sighed heavily and said that her sister was a liar. At that moment, the young man was taken aback, but she calmly said that everything was fine and he didn't need to worry. Leslie said he should just ignore the young lady. At that time, they returned to the hall. Betrian looked at the young lady with a smile, as he noticed that she had already returned. But at that very moment, he asked her for forgiveness. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand why he suddenly apologized to her. Betrian sighed heavily and said that he heard him. The younger brother was intimidating her in the dining room. Leslie looked at the young man in bewilderment and wondered if his brother had tried to intimidate her yesterday, since she had not been scared at all. Betrian sighed heavily and said that it seemed that after this incident, he had spoken with their mother, and that this should not happen again. Betrian looked at the young lady and asked her not to take the incident to heart, as his brother was still young and always doing stupid things. She smiled and said she wasn't scared or anything. He looked at her in bewilderment, unable to understand how such things were possible, knowing that even though his brother was young, they were still of the same blood. Leslie sighed heavily and said that if he really hated her, there would be hostility in his gaze. At that moment, he looked at her in surprise and quietly muttered something. And a moment later, he said that after trying on all the clothes, they should look into other stores. Leslie asked with a happy smile if that was really possible. He smiled and said that, of course, it was possible. A moment later, the maid said with a smile that everything was ready. She sighed heavily and said that her eyes were already hurting from looking closely at all the outfits, but she was glad that they still managed to find what they wanted. After a while, they slowly left the store and walked down the street. Leslie turned around with a happy smile and told her brother that these shoes were very comfortable, and therefore she would like to wear them all the time. They looked with smiles at the girl who was happily rushing towards new discoveries. But after some time, she stopped in front of a toy store. Betrian, at that very moment, he showed his sister the door, and she immediately beamed with joy. A few minutes later, they entered the store, and she froze at the beauty of the toys. Betrian looked at the young lady with a smile and said that if there was something she liked, she could choose whatever she wanted. She was taken aback and said that she just wanted to look at the beautiful toys. Leslie said that nothing bad would happen if they just left, because there was no need for stuffed animals. At that very moment, the young man lifted his sister up and said with a smile that she should choose what she wanted. She was taken aback and said that she was really fine. She didn't need anything. He sighed heavily and asked if it was true. She didn't answer, and the young man, sighing heavily, said that he had no choice but to buy all the toys from the store. The young lady was taken aback, as she didn't expect such a thing. Leslie was taken aback, as she was shocked by everything she heard. Betrion sighed heavily and said that if Salvator left the store without buying anything, then unpleasant rumors would spread. She was shocked and wondered if they were really obliged to buy anything when they entered the store. Then he called the young man and said that he wanted to buy everything. She was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing. The young lady hesitated and called out to the young man. She said sheepishly that in that case, she wanted to buy a black bunny. He looked at her with a smile and agreed. He also said that she should tell him if she wanted anything else, be it food or anything else. He said that she was no longer in that mansion, and therefore should not hold back. He smiled and asked if she understood. The young lady, in turn, squeezed the beautiful toy with a smile and said that she understood everything. Some time later, she drank the wonderful drink with admiration. Madel looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she liked the food. Leslie smiled and said that she liked everything very much. Betrion looked closely at the girl as just a piece of cake, a hot cup of chocolate, and a small toy made her happy. He was furious because he did not know what the Marquise had done to the girl that she was so happy about such trifles. He sighed heavily, but the young lady noticed that he was worried. Madel smiled and pushed a very sweet cookie towards her and told her that she should try it with their hot chocolate. At that moment, the young lady looked at the beautiful cookies in surprise. She carefully placed it in the cup and looked at the cookie with joy. Leslie looked at her brother with great admiration and told him to look. She smiled and said that it was very beautiful. But a moment later, she stood frozen in place as she saw that the cookie had broken. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect anything like this. The young men, in turn, looked at her in horror as she was upset. That same evening, Leslie asked her maid not to tell anyone that she had cried. The maid smiled and said that she would not tell anyone. She was shocked and did not expect that her behavior would upset them so much. Madel looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she would never tell anyone about this, and that now she should rest. Madel looked closely at the young lady and said that when she woke up early in the morning, the poor thing should open the window and should not stand in the cold, as she might get sick. Leslie looked at her maid with a smile and said that she would not do that. A moment later, she looked closely at the maid who was hurrying away and thanked her with a smile for a wonderful day. The maid smiled and wished the young lady sweet dreams. A moment later, she left the room and was lost in her thoughts for a moment as she thought of something that might please the young lady. She came to him with joy because she felt relieved, Leslie. She was glad that you did not help her, and she was grateful to fate that she was still able to be born with the power of darkness. She was glad that she was still able to survive. She never wanted to forget them, those who helped her in difficult times. She wanted to put an end to the Marquise and do it for them. She knew that she would be happy now and then, also after her revenge. The next day, she came into the dining room with a joyful smile. But after a few seconds, she froze and looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. She was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. And after a few minutes, everyone else began to gather. The princess looked closely at her son and said that he should eat and later take Leslie to the library. Leslie looked at Madame and asked what was going on. Madame smiled and said that today Ruenti would be teaching her. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect to hear anything like that. Madame said that her son was quite a famous magician, even though he didn't look like one. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said that when her clothes were ready, she would begin to learn the basics of ball handling. But right now she lacked stamina, and because of this, she was worried about her safety. And after Leslie became stronger, she would begin to learn the etiquette of dancing and other little things. The madam looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she could handle it. Leslie in turn said with confidence that she would endure everything and cope with everything. The madam told the girl with a smile that she should study because knowledge was her future strength. After some time, Jenna presented the young lady with a small dessert after the main meal. Everyone present was surprised. They couldn't understand from what source they started serving dessert, let alone hot chocolate. At the same time, Leslie was delighted as she was served hot chocolate, along with some delicious cookies. But the maid only smiled, thus showing the young league that everything was all right. Leslie was a little worried, as the last time things didn't end very well, but the maid said with a smile that everything was fine, and she didn't need to worry. Leslie obeyed the maid and slowly lowered the cookie into the cup. She sighed heavily, because she knew that the cookie would sink just like yesterday. She stared at the cookie, wanting to watch it until it sank. The maid smiled and told the young lady that she could show everyone else. Leslie sighed heavily, as she realized that soon the same thing would happen as yesterday. At that very moment, she called her older brother. She froze for a moment when she saw that the cookie had not melted. He looked at her with a smile and asked if this was really what she wanted to show him yesterday. He smiled and said that it was very beautiful. Jenna looked at the young lady with a happy smile and said that it was very beautiful and looked as if a snowman was sailing on a boat through the snow. Medell said with a satisfied smile that she had never seen hot chocolate decorated so beautifully before. Last night, all the servants were busy making cookies that wouldn't sink too quickly in a cup of hot chocolate. They timed themselves, and after a few unsuccessful attempts, they succeeded and were therefore very happy. They were very pleased that the lady now had enough time to show everything to everyone else. Everyone was glad that they were able to make the young lady smile. In turn, Leslie happily said that she had planted a snowman. Ruenti froze in shock and wondered if everyone had gone crazy in the last few days. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly and felt very awkward, as she had completely forgotten herself and was enjoying some cookies like a child. She sighed heavily and decided to let go of all her thoughts, since she saw that everyone was clapping, which meant that everyone was having fun. But after a few minutes, she was taken aback and looked in surprise at the young man who put a stack of books on her. Ruenti looked closely at the young lady and said that he had brought her the items he would teach her from now on. At that very moment, she bowed low and asked the young man to take care of hers. He looked at her in surprise and did not understand why she bowed so low. He sighed heavily and said that he would teach her anyway, because his mother had entrusted him with this task. Leslie looked at him in surprise, but still agreed. Ruenti looked closely at the girl and told her to sit down quickly, and he also informed her that she should come to him several times a week at the appointed time. Leslie froze as she saw books on ancient language, sacred language history, philosophy, and even etiquette. She looked closely at the young man and asked what exactly she would study. He immediately said that she would study everything that was needed to control her power. He also said that he heard from his mother that she had mastered the darkness. He sighed heavily and said that he knew nothing about either of those powers because her family had hidden everything about their abilities for many years. Ruenti looked closely at the young lady online and said that her power was similar to ordinary magic, so it could probably be controlled in about the same way. He said that she should be able to read the ancient language and the sacred language as well. He also said that she had to read the art of noble etiquette, as well as the theory of the philosopher. At the same moment, he added more books on the history of the continent. The young lady was taken aback, as there were a lot of books. He smiled and asked if she got the point. Ruenti knew these weren't the basics, and even books like these were rarely covered in the senior years of the academy, but he knew he had to treat her like this. He was puzzled and simply did not understand how anyone from her family could join his family, because the mere thought of what they did to restrict them made him furious. Ruenti was burning with anger and fury, because it seemed to him that everyone would have forgotten, and now everyone was burning with delight when they saw the young lady. Ruenti was furious and didn't understand how she had managed to attract all of us to my side in one go, but he knew he wouldn't forget what her family had done. He looked at her intently in a way he hoped would be beyond her capabilities, but in turn, he asked with a smirk if she would say she couldn't handle someone like him. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she could decipher the ancient and holy language a little. She read Aventon's theories up to the middle, but stopped because they were, as he said, too complicated for her. However, she read all these theories of Nirokia's. Leslie also said that she had studied everything about the history of the continent up to the birth of the Fourth Empire, and she had also read The Art of Noble Etiquette in full. She wondered if this was not enough. The young man froze in place from shock and surprise. She sighed heavily as she realized that this was not enough. Leslie remembered how she had previously been beaten because she was not smart enough. She was told that she could not answer basic simple questions, and this showed her ignorance. Leslie knew it was all in the past, and she hoped the young man wouldn't do that to her. Society looked at her and called. At that moment, he beamed and asked if she had really read the theories of Nairoki. The young lady was taken aback and looked at him in bewilderment. He looked at her with a smile and said that she was very young. He wanted to know if she had really read this book. Leslie was taken aback and said that she had read everything. And at that very moment, the young man asked what her favorite paragraph was. She smiled and said that her favorite paragraph was God gave people everything. They talked excitedly with each other about the book for some time. Ruenti joyfully shouted that she had indeed read the book, because this book is one of the most underrated. So few people are familiar with this book. The young man knew that this philosopher was simply a genius, but everyone considered him the eccentric of the century because he was the only commoner among all the famous philosophers. But he had a strange opinion and atypical thoughts, as well as theories. Unfortunately, not everyone could understand his brilliant thinking. At that very moment, the young lady said that she liked his theory, especially about magic and divine power. The young man joyfully shouted that he never thought that he would meet a like-minded person, and now he was happy. He was amazed that at her young age, she already knew the ancient language, the sacred language, and even history up to the birth of the empire. He looked at her closely because he realized that she knew so much that people might inadvertently think that she was a true genius. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was simply a genius, since many graduates of the academy had only basic knowledge of ancient and sacred languages, and most of them did not even begin to read important books, because nobles simply did not need it. She was surprised since she did not expect to hear such a thing. But at the same time, the young lady was very glad that her knowledge was sufficient, but she did not intend to give up and wanted to continue studying. He smiled and said that he was looking forward to it. He hoped that she would still be able to cope with all the information since she knew enough theory. In turn, he looked at the young lady with a satisfied grin, as he wanted to start by controlling her power. But a moment later, he was taken aback and threw all his thoughts away. Ruenti understood that although she looked cute, she was still from the family of his enemy. He was puzzled because he knew that he should not fall for her charms, because he was the intellect of his family, and he was the last hope of the family. He understood that if he fell for her charm, his family would collapse. He sighed heavily and said that usually people study the theory of Aventin. But at that very moment, the young lady said with a smile that she liked the theories of Nairoki better. She smiled and said that they were difficult to understand, but the more she read, the more she liked them. The young man, with a satisfied smile, shouted that everything was correct. At that very moment, he was taken aback and shouted to himself that he should not give in to her charm. She smiled and said that this sadness, but the theories of the Nairoki, were looked down upon only because he was a commoner. She knew that he could be valued more if he was also from a noble family. The young man, with a joyful smile, shouted that he thought the same. But at that very moment, he simply hit his head on the table. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he acted in such a way. In turn, the young lady said that she had not had the opportunity to discuss this with anyone before. She extended her cute little hand to him and said that she was looking forward to his lessons. He sighed heavily and said that he would be a very strict teacher. She said with a smile that it was good because he would be able to teach her a lot. He looked at her intently and said that since she was already familiar with his theories, they could move straight to practice. She looked at him in surprise and asked if, by practice, he meant using her power. He sighed heavily and said that it was so because he should understand how her power worked. Ruenti looked closely at the girl and said that his mother told him that when they first met, she was able to cover the entire mansion in darkness. Ruenti asked the young lady if she could do it again, but this time he wanted her to cover only the room in darkness. At that moment, the young lady used her power, and darkness engulfed the room. He patted her head with a smile, as her strength was impressive. The young lady was glad that she had earned his praise. A moment later, he asked her to try to move something with her powers. Leslie was a little surprised. He smiled and said that it would probably be better if he showed her everything first. Ruenti smiled and said that although he didn't know much about her abilities, he could definitely tell that she was strong, so she needed to learn how to properly control her power. Looking at the young lady, he said that any power has a potential backfire. A moment later, he laid out several logs in front of her and asked her to break them. At that very moment, the young lady used her strength and broke the log. Ruenti sighed heavily and said that he had heard that some people could control their abilities better in certain situations, but that such a situation was very rare. He sighed heavily and said, "Young lady, it's best to avoid them because they won't make her any stronger." At that moment, she nodded in agreement. The young man asked if she wanted to try again. She agreed and immediately used her magic. But unfortunately, everything turned out the other way around. She was furious because she knew she had to do everything in her power to control her power. A moment later, the young man closed her eyes and informed her that she had had enough training for today. He looked closely at the destruction from her side and reported that she had done a very good job, since at first she had destroyed all 6, but now only 4. He said that it took many mages a long time to perfect their powers, but even if she was not a genius, it would take her more than a year. He said with a smile that she was making progress incredibly quickly. He looked at her closely and said that the source of her problems was nothing other than her stamina. He said that she would have to improve it, and at the same time, she had to eat and sleep well. He also said that she could do exercises to become more resilient. And Leslie asked with a happy smile if this was true. Ruenti said with a smile that he was a genius, and she could believe him. The princess looked closely at the young man, as finding him took longer than she expected. She knew that he worked in the northern part of the building. Beatrion looked closely at the mother, and said that it was the man who leaked all the information, and most likely someone or something forced him to remain silent, because they could not force him to talk. The young man was taken aback, and shouted that they were mistaken, and that he was just a servant. The princess looked at him with a grin and asked if he was really saying that he was innocent now. She immediately approached him and asked with a grin if he wanted to say anything else. She looked at him intently and said that if he told the truth, he would be able to join the Lord without suffering. He sighed heavily and lowered his head, but after a few minutes, he said that he had simply told the lady about her affairs. But to their regret, the man was unable to say anything more as he died. She sighed heavily and looked at the man in surprise, as everything had happened as she had expected. And now she was sure that something was keeping him silent. The princess sighed heavily and looked intently at the man's body. The princess sighed heavily as she realized that a curse had been cast to kill the bearer if he uttered a certain word. Jenna. Looking at the lady, she said that it could be poison. The princess asked in surprise if that was really the case. Jenna said that everything could be exactly like that, but she still had to look at the man's body. Looking at the body, she said that he had been poisoned, and at least several days had passed, not just one day. She remembered how the servant had previously said that his friend was ill and that he vomited almost every night. The princess looked intently at her subordinate and asked who the servant was. At the same moment, she looked intently at her mistress and told her about the young man. She sighed heavily and said that he was overconfident and somewhat tactless, and she assumed that he was lured by the opportunity to increase his status, considering that he had betrayed them. And she was not sure that he did not understand what was right and what was wrong. The young man sighed heavily and said that the man did not even realize that he was being used until it was too late. Jenna sighed heavily and said that, despite the pain, he did not visit the doctor. She thought that he had an optimistic character, since he did not give up hope until the very end. She was puzzled, because ever since Lojen left the mansion and returned to his homeland, she was short of hands. At that very moment, the princess called her son. She looked at him intently and said that she wanted him to find out who was behind all this. The young man looked intently at the commander and asked if the man below was really the Marquis's man. Betrion said with a grin that someone like the Marquis couldn't do something like that to their house. He was well aware that it was someone more powerful. Sometime later, the young man was eating with the young lady and talking with Anisu. And smiles. Leslie asked the young man if he really lived on the estate. He said that it was true. Looking at the young lady, he said that aristocrats like him, even writing their name on the tapestry, were freer than other magicians, and he was still from the Salvator family. But still, just her magic lived in boring estates. She smiled and asked if she could ask one more question. He said with a smile that, of course, she could ask him a lot of questions, but first she had to eat a sandwich. At that very moment, the young lady began to eat. He was taken aback when she started coughing, realizing they had mixed up their sandwiches. But after the young lady drank the water, she began to eat the sandwich with a smile. Leslie looked closely at her companion and said that she had already bitten several times, and asked if it could now ask him a question. He smiled and said that one, of course, could ask him a question, but he also said that they were in no hurry, and she could do it at any time. She looked closely at the young man and asked excitedly why the imperial family and the Salvatoris did not get along with each other. Ruenti sighed heavily and said that few people know about this history, but his family existed long before the founding of the empire, so the imperial family does not favor them. He didn't tell her anything else and continued his snack. Leslie looked at him in surprise and asked if it was only because of that. He sighed heavily and said that, usually when the authorities feel that someone can have more influence than them, they strive to rise even higher, and the imperial family believed that his family could surpass them. That is why they did not like them. He asked the young lady if she knew what the imperial family's coat of arms looked like. Leslie sighed heavily and said that she knew, and it looked like a snake with several heads, and one head held the sun in its mouth, and the other the moon. He smiled and said that everything was correct, because the sun and the moon are symbols, meaning the sky, and the snake, holding them in the paste, symbolizes that the sky belongs to the imperial family. He looked at her intently and said that the imperial family was so arrogant that they had appropriated heaven for themselves. He said that she could imagine how it irritated them that their house could be more influential, and especially since they had a very difficult character. He said that she should have noticed this since she had already met the princess. He said that his mother was not the kind of person who could bow her head to others. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that their house existed even before the empire, and their own abilities did not disappear, but on the contrary, they became even stronger. She realized that if they weren't monsters and weren't avoided out of fear, then everything would be different. She wondered what would happen to them if the empire began to threaten them. She was immediately taken aback and asked if it was really they themselves who had spread rumors that they were monsters. He looked at her with a smile and said that everything was true and that it was made up by his ancestors. After all, with their strength and character, it was not difficult to live up to this rumor. He was glad that she understood everything he wanted to say, like a fish, that it did not matter at all what they were called. The main thing was that the attention from the imperial family had decreased. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that this was not true because they were all very kind and caring. She shouted that they did not look like a monster at all. He looked at her with a smile and said that they looked like that only for her. Leslie puffed out her beautiful cheeks and said that she had no idea that the imperial family disliked them for something like that. He smiled and said that it was not that simple. He asked if she had seen Conrad at the estate. He said that the young man, had imperial blood, but they were still friends. He sighed heavily and said that, on the other hand, many years had passed since the founding of the empire, and it could not be said that the imperial family had hated his family for a long period. A moment later, a maid entered their office and told the young gentleman that the princess had called him as well as the young lady. He was surprised because he did not understand what had happened, but he asked the maid to tell him that they would soon come to his mother. At that very moment, he looked intently at the young lady. He also asked why she still called him Sir Ruenti. Leslie looked at him in surprise, not knowing what to answer. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer, but he said that in any case, she would soon become part of his family, and she should understand this. Leslie sighed heavily and said that this was true, but she was still not officially adopted. He said that it did not matter at all, since his mother had already decided that she would become the only lady of the family. Ruenti looked closely at the young lady and asked if she didn't want to be adopted, or if she didn't like her new name. Leslie was taken aback and immediately shouted that it wasn't so, and she would very much like the princess to adopt her. Ruenti looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and said that now she would become the youngest in their house. He also said that from now on, she could call him something else, because the way she addressed him now sounded a little dry. The young lady sighed heavily and looked intently at the young man. He extended his hand to her with a smile and called her his sweet little sister. Some time later, they walked leisurely to the princess. He sighed heavily and said that he had mentioned Conrath earlier, since the princess had asked him to visit the estate soon. He asked his new sister if she knew the young man, and that he was a paladin. She sighed heavily and said that she knew about it. Ruenti said the young man had divine healing powers and could pacify anyone. Ruenti, looking at the lady said that most people don't know, but when the power of a family weakens, they stop using it. And yet their family's special abilities are superhuman strength and magic, so they never had the need to use divine powers. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked if his friend would come to them for her powers. He looked at her with a smile and said that everything was correct. She asked in surprise if they shouldn't tell him about her abilities. He smiled and said that the princess would talk to the young man, but before that, she would decide whether it would be better to hide it or tell him in order to get his help. He said that if the darkness didn't get out of control, then it would be better for them, but just in case they needed to prepare in advance. Leslie sighed and said that the darkness wouldn't do that. Renti said that if she broke out of the limits, her body wouldn't be able to last even a few minutes, so they had to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Sometime later, the young man was already in front of his mother. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly and awaited an audience in the room behind the door. The princess looked at her son and asked how the young lady was doing. He thought for a moment and said that she was very smart and could probably be called a genius. The princess was surprised by this fact. He smiled and said that in terms of intelligence, she was not inferior to the graduates of the academy. She was exceptionally good in sacred and ancient languages, although she was a little lacking in theology, but with a little help, she would quickly grasp the essence. At that very moment, he said that she was really a genius in the field of philosophy, and with the exception of philosophy, she lacked knowledge in other subjects, but her etiquette was quite specific. And sometimes she behaved like a simple maid. And she had absolutely no pride. Even he could see that she had been bullied her entire life. He looked closely at his mother and asked if the nth lady had really come to their estate herself. The princess sighed heavily and said that it was true, and it was hard to believe. She smiled and said that she was quite surprised to see her in front of the gate. The princess looked at her son with a smile and asked if he liked the young lady. He looked away from her and said that he liked her a little. The princess smiled and told her son that he should already love her because she also liked the philosopher Nairoki. The young man was taken aback and asked his mother if she really knew Analog Bent Over, and said that when she visited the Brand's mansion, her eldest daughter showed her the house. She said that she then looked around the library, and the room there was large and luxurious, but there was no sign of anyone reading books, and it seemed to her that this room was only for show. But the only book that had apparently been touched was the book of the great philosopher, and yet it was carefully hidden. And then she thought that in the Marcus's family, there could only be one person who had read this book many times. Ruenti sighed heavily and looked away from his mother in embarrassment, knowing she should have told him about this earlier. She smiled and said that hiding it was much more interesting than telling everything. She looked at him closely and said that she thought it would be better if he saw her for himself and appreciated hers. He sighed heavily and informed his mother that the young lady needed someone to teach her etiquette. He wanted her to be taught the manners of a true noblewoman, not a maid. And he also told her mother that the young lady needed to eat and improve her physical fitness, as her arms and legs looked as if they would break immediately if she fell. He looked closely at his mother and said that he also wanted Conrad to protect her. The princess looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that it was so. And to tell the truth, he had already seen how great her power was. And at that moment, he understood why the princess was interested in her. But he was puzzled and didn't know if she would be able to keep her powers under control. He asked his mother what she planned to do if they got the better of her. He said that they needed to be prepared for any unexpected situation because Leslie had no idea how dangerous her abilities were. He sighed heavily and told his mother that one day that very day would come, and it would not hurt her to have a paladin by her side. Madame sighed heavily and said that such a thing could happen. She knew that the divine powers not only healed the wounds, but also tamed the force that was ready to break out. Ruenti sighed heavily and said that there were also things that were beyond their control. Ruenti sighed heavily and said that it would be difficult to remain calm, knowing what monstrous powers the young lady possessed, and it could be that she was not inferior to the great paladin in her own strength. Madame looked closely at her son and said that from now on, he would be the teacher of the young league in all subjects except theology and etiquette, because that way they would both be more comfortable. He sighed heavily and said that he would do everything. Madame said that she would immediately hire someone for the young lady who could teach her etiquette, and she herself would teach her the basics of fencing, and when she was busy, she would ask Hart to replace her. Ruenti looked at his mother and asked what she would do with theology. She smiled and said she would leave that to Conrad, after all hiring a priest. As a teacher was a fairly common practice. He looked at her in surprise and asked if the young man would really agree. She smiled and said that he had no reason to refuse, and that on the contrary, he might be happy to move on to the young lady, since he would not be able to understand all of her plans. Some time later, the young woman could barely walk into the room and asked Madame if she had called her. Madame looked closely at the young lady and said that the Marquise had summoned her to court. Leslie was shocked by what she heard. She did not understand why he needed such a thing. She was furious because she understood that it was the Marquis who should be punished. The madam smiled and said that she didn't know, but most likely he wanted to sue her because she kidnapped Leslie and forcibly held her. The young lady was shocked by what she heard and shouted that it was not so. Madame smiled and said that Mark had reported that she had stolen it to find out more about his family's power, and he also claimed that she had threatened him. She said that they did not give her any medicine when she was sick. They even tortured her and starved her. But rumors began to spread that he came to her to ask for help to save his daughter. But in the end, he left with only a serious wound on his hand. Leslie was in shock and screamed that it was not true. She burst into tears and screamed that the Marquise had tried to kill her, and that the one who saved her was the princess. She screamed that Madame never wanted to hurt her. She was furious because she realized that he always cared only about himself. At that very moment, restraining her rage, she told the princess that she had a request. Leslie screamed and asked Madame to take her into court as a witness, and she would tell everything that the Marquis and his family had done to her. Madame smiled and said that it was a good idea. She looked closely at the young lady and sighed heavily and said that they would hardly believe her words and would listen to the Marquise instead. The lady was shocked and screamed that she was a victim. She did not understand why they would all believe the Marquise. She looked at the young lady intently and said that they would make her out to be a lost child. A weak child who had lived in her own imagination since childhood, and he was probably afraid that they were listening to her, so he spread false rumors. She sighed heavily and said that all children should be protected, and she knew about this law. And even if the Marquise admitted that he had treated her cruelly according to this law, she would still have to return to her family, because the Marquise was her biological parent. She sighed heavily and said, "Young lady, that later Parliament will find another protector for her." Leslie collapsed onto the sofa with a crash. Trembling with fear, she said that she wanted to go home. She wondered if she could even count on being safe in this disgusting place for a few days. She understood that if she returned home, she would be killed by her own family. At that moment, the madam looked closely at the young lady and reassured her. She smiled and said that she would give her their last name. She said that she would not sit idly by while her family took her away. The Marquise smiled and told the girl not to worry, as she just had to focus on growing up strong and healthy. The princess said that, at the moment, the most important thing to worry about was her new room and what furniture she would like to put in it. Leslie looked at Madame in surprise. The lady smiled and said that her husband had always dreamed of having a daughter, and said that he would furnish an entire floor of the mansion if he ever had one. The young lady was shocked by the statement, and she said that an entire floor was too much. The lady smiled and said that she thought so too, and that is why they would now give her a separate room. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not need to worry about such things now, and that she needed to choose the furniture that she would like to place in the room. She said with a smile that she should think about what kind of cookie she would put in her hot chocolate tomorrow. She sighed heavily and said that next time she would just drink it. The princess asked with a smile if she really felt sorry for the cookie. Leslie looked hard at Madame and said that if there was anything she could do, she should tell her. Madame looked at the young lady with a smile and said that there was something, and perhaps it would not be very pleasant for her. Leslie looked closely at Madame and nodded in agreement. At that very moment, Madame asked the young lady why the Marquise had tried to kill her. She wanted to know if this was related to the reason why the younger children in their family died an early death. The princess asked the young lady to tell her more about it. At that very moment, Leslie burst into tears and said that she was born to be a victim. She told the whole story, and most importantly, she told how she managed to gain power. She sighed heavily and said that because of revenge, the children supported her and shared their power. Now, the princess understood why the young girl's eyes were filled with determination. She looked at her intently and told her not to worry, as she would get what she wanted. But at that very moment, she asked the girl if she really thought that the children had saved her only for the sake of revenge. The young lady in turn kept thinking about Madame's words. She did not know what exactly they meant, if not revenge. She clearly remembered how she touched the fire for just a moment, but it was very painful for her. She knew that it was incomparable pain, with how scary and painful it was for those children. So she thought that this time Madame was wrong, because no matter how mature the princess was, sometimes she made mistakes. She knew that the adults were also wrong, just like her maid who fell on level ground. Some time later, the young lady happily entered the dining room and greeted everyone. She looked closely at her brother and asked with a smile how he slept. He smiled and said that he slept well, and also said that if she was very tired, she could sleep some more. Leslie smiled and said that she was not tired at all. Everyone present looked at the young people in surprise, as they got along very well with each other. Ruenti said with a smile that yesterday they had a lively conversation about philosophy. Serene looked at his son. He was glad that he was able to find a common language with the girl, but still they all became close to her, except for him. At the same time, the madam smiled and said that they had a conversation before the young lady arrived. Looking at the girl, she said that she was looking for a teacher of etiquette and someone who could teach her theology. Cyrene said with a smile that the Viscountess was a very good person and that she would be able to teach her well. Leslie knew that if a man considered the Viscountess a good person, then she had nothing to fear. She knew she was lucky in this situation. A moment later, Madame said that she had entrusted theology to young Master Conrad. The man was taken aback, as he had not expected such a thing. At that very moment, he shouted to his wife that he was against this. He shouted that a woman could also teach theology. He did not understand why it was the young gentleman who had to do this. He shouted to his wife that she should not forget that the young man was a boy, and Leslie was a girl. He shouted that he was against this. Betrion looked at his mother and said that he was also against this, and thought that it was worth looking for another person. He asked if she had really said that she wanted to entrust theology to a member of the Grand Duke's family. He said it would be a worry to the Grand Duke, but a moment later, he said that the most important thing was what the young lady thought about it herself. The princess sighed heavily and said that the young lady already knew the young gentleman. Betrion sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said that she had forgotten the most important opinion. She asked the young lady if she wanted the young master to be her teacher. Serene was puzzled and shouted at the girl that he was against it, but the madam quickly shut his mouth. Madam smiled and said that this was the most important thing, and looking at her relatives, she said that she would contact them later. The madam looked at the young lady with a smile and said that her brother would teach her everything else. The young lady was a little surprised, as she thought that the other subjects would be taught by one, and not the other. She looked at her brother with joy, as she knew that she was very lucky to have a teacher, and she happily called him brother. He said with a joyful smile that since they would soon become a family, she could afford to call him that. The men froze in shock as she no longer called anyone by any affectionate names. Sarayen looked at the young lady intently and called her as he also wanted her to call him affectionately. Leslie was taken aback, not knowing what to do, since she could not call the man her father, because she had not yet received his last name. She glanced sideways at Madame, for she realized that if she called him father, she would have to call the princess mother. Leslie was shocked and did not understand how she could call such an unimaginable person a mother. Betrion looked intently at his father and said that it would be too hard for the young lady. Betrion looked at the young lady with a smile and said that at first she should act slowly, and as she got used to it, she could turn to others, but first she had to call him brother. The man was shocked by everything that was happening. Ruenti said she could act in order. He said she would soon become a member of their family anyway. Leslie stood still for a moment, gathering her courage. At that very moment, she looked at her brother and called him. He looked at her with a smile, and in turn, the young lady beamed with happiness. Serene stood up abruptly and, looking at the young lady, said that she could also call him affectionately at least once. At that very moment, Leslie looked at him with a tender smile and called him father. Serene was taken aback and froze in place in shock. He was shocked and at the same time pleasantly happy, but he also did not forget to wipe away the tears of happiness on his face. At that moment, the young lady was taken aback and looked at the princess in bewilderment. Madame, in turn, looked at the young lady with a tender smile. Leslie was taken aback, not knowing what to do, and trembling she tried to call her, but still nothing worked. Some time later, she met the young man. He looked at her with a smile and said that knowing that she was partial to sweets, he bought all the known sweets in the store. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she liked it. The young lady, in turn, looked away from the young man and said that, unfortunately, she had no appetite at the moment, and she also said that he did not need to worry. She felt very awkward around him. Leslie was a little confused and embarrassed, as she didn't know how to communicate with him. She was very excited, because to her regret, she did not know how to start a conversation with him. She understood that if she made even the slightest mistake, Madame could become a laughingstock because of her. Leslie knew she had to keep quiet, but she didn't know what to say. He looked at her with a smile and said she shouldn't be nervous at all. Conrad smiled and said that today they would simply exchange greetings. A moment later, he presented her with a beautiful little piece of cake. Conrad looked at the young girl with a smile and said that he would teach her the sacred language and theology. He smiled and said that her brother had remarked that her knowledge of the sacred language was on the same level as that of an academy graduate, and at the same time, he had called her a genius. The young lady was embarrassed by this and said that he was greatly overpraising her. Conrad told the young lady that at her age she was like a genius and knew many interesting things. He praised her, and she meanwhile was filled with embarrassment. The young man looked at her with a satisfied smile. He also said that he heard that she liked to read the theories of the philosopher Nairoki. Conrad said with a smile that thanks to this philosopher, he was able to become friends with Ruenti, since the young man was a devoted fan of the philosopher. He said with a smile that it was difficult to find fans of his work, so he usually lied that he was not a fan, but his face said otherwise. The young lady smiled and told the young man that he was absolutely right. Conrad looked at the young lady intently and said that if she liked this philosopher, then most likely she had read Emeria's history books. But the young lady said that unfortunately, she had not heard of such an author. He smiled and said that few nobles had read the works of the author of the Rain Temple, because she a woman and a commoner. Leslie was surprised by this fact. He smiled and said that the woman was rated very low, because as a rule, books by authors of noble origin were more popular. But he still said that he liked her books. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise and wondered if he really liked reading historical literature. He said with a smile that these books were not like a fairy tale, but rather a history book. She was surprised as she did not expect to hear something like that. He said with a smile that if she was interested, he could bring us some books about the author to class, although it would not be easy to get hold of these books. He said with a smile that her patrons would be able to obtain this book as they were very kind people. At the same moment, the young lady smiled and told her companion that he was completely right. She said that all the Salvatores are very kind and attentive. He smiled and said that he agreed with her statement because he did not understand why people called them monsters. She beamed with happiness and said that she agreed with him. She smiled and said that Cyrene had a strong and frightening aura, but in reality he was very kind, and Betrion seemed strict, but in reality he was very gentle. Leslie said, with a smile, that Renty was very smart, and the princess was simply an amazing person. She shouted that Madame looked amazing in her mask, but unfortunately, everyone was used to judging them only by their appearance. A moment later, she was taken aback as she realized that she had said too much. The young man smiled and said that the cake was very tasty and she should try it. At that very moment, the young lady tasted the cake and said with admiration that it was very tasty. He smiled and said that he was very glad that she liked it. He said that he was afraid that the cake he chose would not be to her taste, but he was very glad that she liked it, and he called her a lady. He looked at her intently and said that she had not yet told him her last name. Leslie was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She looked intently at the young man and asked him to call her simply by her first name. She did not want to say her last name at all. He bowed with a smile and said that in that case, she should also call him only by his first name. After some time, they finished their meal, and the young lady looked at him intently and said that she had one request for him. He felt like someone had been staring at him for quite some time now. At that very moment, he looked at the young lady, and I saw her gaze. He sighed heavily and said that since the young lady wished for something like this, he would gladly accept her offer. Some time later, he returned to his estate, and the butler asked the young master with a smile how his visit had gone. Conrad said with a smile that everything went very well, and he even met Lady Leslie. The butler looked at the young gentleman in surprise and asked if he had really met the daughter about whom there were many rumors. He asked the young gentleman what he thought about the young lady. The young man smiled and said that she was very cheerful, not at all like the rest of his family members. He saw that she was petite, pale, and looked harmless. He felt as if he was looking at an innocent white rabbit that was surrounded by dark and ferocious beasts. The butler looked at the young gentleman intently and said with a smile that it seemed the young lady was truly an amazing person. Conrad sighed heavily and said that it was true, but it seemed she had her own difficulties. As he was leaving, the young man asked the butler to bring him some books and tea without sugar. The butler smiled and said that he would do everything immediately. Conrad looked at the butler intently and asked if he could make a list of all the shops that sold desserts. The butler was surprised, as he knew that the young master did not like desserts. Conrad said with a smile that he would like to know all the possible shops that made sweet desserts, because he thought it would be useful to make such a list, since the shop they chose today was very tasty. He smiled and said that it was bad manners to come to someone's home without a gift. And even more so, he really wanted to get closer to the young lady. Since the first time she saw him, she was very surprised. The next time they met, she was very embarrassed. And today, she smiled warmly at him. He wondered what kind of face she would make next time. Madame looked closely at the letter, and with a smile told her husband that only he could find this letter so quickly. She asked with a smile if he was still upset that he had to get up and work in the morning. Madame knew that the young lady's strength was not innate, and her body could not withstand heavy loads. Madame was puzzled, since their family had been engaged in sacrifice for many years. She realized that they were the monsters. She understood all her hatred for the lady, but she did not at all want it to take hold of her. Cyrene said that he would not be for the young master, and he believed that the Grand Duke's activities lately were very suspicious. He also wanted his son not to meet the young gentleman anymore. Madame told her husband with a smile not to interfere with the children's friendship. She said that if he thought the young man was acting suspiciously, he should continue to watch him. Cyrene sighed heavily and asked his wife if she wasn't worried about the young lady. He kept telling her that things could be very dangerous. The madame smiled and said that she was worried, because she knew that the lady was not so weak. She looked at her husband with a smile and said that he would have to work a little more with the delivery, but he needed to deliver the letter as quickly as possible. She said that this letter was to be received by a very important person in the court. She smiled and said that she did not trust anyone except her beloved husband. The princess thanked him with a smile. At that very moment, the man beamed with happiness, but he still told his wife that he wanted her to be happy, He wanted the happiness in her life to be much greater than the pain that she had experienced before. The man quickly ran up to the Marquis and, sighing heavily, said that he was worried, as there had been a lot of rumors lately that he had locked himself in the estate. He looked closely at the Marquis and said that he did not even answer letters. He asked the Marquis if everything was all right with him and his hand. The Marquis turned away angrily and told his comrade that he was all right, and that we shouldn't worry as he had run too fast, and he had the impression that he would soon burst. The man looked at the Marquis with a grin and said that he had heard this story. The man mockingly said that the princess was strong for her age. He also said that he heard the Marquis had gathered all his knights to defeat her. For some time, the man continued to mock his comrade. The Marquis looked at the man with fury and said that it did not seem like he was worried about him. The man looked closely at the Marquis and said with a smile that he should not behave like that, and as he left, he wished him good health. The Marquis glared at the man as he taunted him. He was very angry because he just wanted the child back, but he was forced to bow his head, and now everyone was laughing at him. He was furious because he was being ridiculed for such a thing. He understood that a daughter should honor her father as if he were a god. He knew that in the old times, if she married a mercenary commander, she would lose her title and be called upon to walk the earth. He was furious because he understood that she, a woman, could not do anything to him. He was furious, but he knew there was a child protection law, so he had to act before it happened again. He knew that his last hope was his beloved daughter. Who was the first prince's bride? He understood that he could ask the prince for help with the trial. He hoped that everything would get better soon, and he would be able to win. He knew that once he got his daughter back, the first thing he would do was correct her manners. The Marquis was pleased with himself, as he had previously read a book that contained a lot of useful information about the chain that many people died in creating. The chain is not perfect, but it could control the darkness. If you wrap your head and body, then the person will not be able to use the power of darkness. He looked into the distance with a grin, because he knew that as soon as he got his daughter back, he would do the same to her. At that very moment, he was taken aback as he heard Madame's voice. Madame bowed and informed him that the Dowager Empress was expecting him. Some time later, the Marquis arrived for an audience with the Empress. He bowed with a smile and greeted her. She looked closely at the man and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and she also said that she heard that he was not feeling well, but she was happy to see that he was in good health. He thanked her with a smile for her concern. She smiled and said that he, as always, amuses her. He sighed heavily and said that he was sad that his oratorical skills were not enough to please her more. She smiled and said that she always enjoyed meeting him because she had nothing better to do. The Marquis beamed with happiness when he heard this. He looked at her intently and asked if she would listen to his story, for he knew that shameful rumors about him had reached her ears. He said that he would like to talk about his unfortunate, their youngest daughter. She sighed heavily and asked if he really meant the story that the princess had kidnapped his daughter. The Empress looked at the man closely and said that he could tell her if there was anything she could do to help him. He looked at her with a smile and asked her to convene a court of aristocrats. The court of aristocrats can only be convened by decree of the emperor under the name of death sentence of honor. If the sins of one of the participants are revealed during the trial, he will lose his rank and be demoted to a commoner. In the empire, rank built less life, and there was no punishment stronger than the loss of status. But in the case of such authoritative families as Salvador, there was a possibility that they would not lose their rank, but they could be demoted on the social ladder. At that very moment, he bowed low and began to beg the Empress. He knew that the timid emperor was trying to avoid conflict, but the young Dowager Empress had no intention of doing so. The late emperor's wife, Medea Sienne Lacadia, formerly known as Apollonia Itniba, was a princess of a small kingdom. The late emperor considered the kingdoms a nuisance, so to prevent any conflicts, their beautiful princess, who was considered the heart of the kingdom, offered herself to him. At the same time, the emperor promised her several things. Firstly, the kingdom was to join the empire, and secondly, the princess would become empress. Despite the discontent of the noble houses of the empire, they married when she had just turned 20. The girl cast aside everything connected with her past and took the greatest post in the empire. She married an emperor who was well over 50, and she became a stepmother to a prince older than herself. Then the emperor suddenly died of illness, and this became the downfall of the former empress. He looked at her intently and said that if she had allowed him to convene a court of aristocrats, he would never have forgotten her kindness. He smiled and said that soon his daughter would marry the prince, and in the future, when the prince grew up, he would be able to help the empress. The empress smiled and said that she had never imagined that the marquise cared about her so much. He said with a smile that she was the most important lady in the empire, and he should take care of her. At that very moment, she said that she must convey his words to the prince, and she would do so. She said with a smile that they would become relatives in the future, and she could not close her eyes to the fact that her family member was going through difficult times. The marquis thanked the young empress, and she reassured him with a smile, as she intended to help a man who was in trouble. Some time later, the maid informed the empress that she had seen the marquis off. The empress smiled and asked her lady-in-waiting if he left in a good mood. The girl smiled and said that he left with a wide smile on his face. She was furious because she had given him some information so that he could stop the princess, but instead his daughter was kidnapped. She didn't expect him to be so stupid. However, she knew that he was the man she needed. She knew that he was only concerned about his family, and she did not at all understand what position he was in, since he firmly believed that he could defeat the princess. She said with a smile that, since they would be related, she thought that she should help him, but now she was worried that she might have made a mistake in choosing a bride for the prince. The girl reassured the empress with a smile, since the engagement could be easily broken off. The empress smiled and said that it was so, and she also gave orders to her ladies-in-waiting. She knew that if she hated him, he was still the emperor, and should show mercy so that for his mother, he would at least convene a court of aristocrats. She knew that the marquis turned to her, since he could not do it himself. At that very moment, she asked her maid of honor what the name of the young lady who was with the princess was. The girl smiled and said that the young lady's name was Leslie. She smiled as she noticed that the name was very cute. The young lady looked at the empress in surprise, as for some reason she laughed. She knew that the given name meant a garden with hollies, and the hollyflower meant a happy and peaceful family. She imagined how they treated her, since they did not bother to give her a second name. She smiled as she realized that the marquis was quite the man. She was very eager to meet the young lady. Some time later, Madame greeted the young lady with joy. Leslie froze for a moment when she saw the Viscountess. The Viscountess introduced herself, and bowing said that she would teach her etiquette. Leslie bowed and introduced herself using only her first name. Madame looked at her in surprise. Leslie wondered if she had done it wrong. She asked Madame to take care of her. Leslie was taken aback and wondered if she had misbehaved again. The madam looked at her intently and said that everything was wrong. The young lady trembled with fear as she knew that she would be scolded. The madam looked at the young and beautiful lady with a smile and asked her to look at her. The Viscountess passed by and told the girl that she did not need to bow like that. She smiled and said that she was a simple etiquette teacher, and the young lady was from a noble family, and bowed like that only when meeting someone of a higher rank. She smiled and said that this was usually how common people greeted an aristocrat. Leslie was taken aback, as she had been told completely different information earlier. A moment later, she smiled and said that if she understood. The Viscountess, looking at the lady, began to list all the high-ranking persons whom she had to bow down to so low. She told the young lady to remember that there were several powerful women besides herself. A moment later, she showed her the correct movement when bowing. She also told the girl that there were not many people in the empire to whom she should bow so low. She said that when a young lady greeted members of the imperial family, she should bow even lower, as that was how she showed her respect. A moment later, the teacher praised the young lady. Leslie thanked the teacher for the knowledge with a joyful smile. The Viscountess looked at the girl with a joyful smile, as she was very charming. A moment later, she said that she would like to show her something. Leslie looked at the small box. In surprise, Madame smiled and said that it contained cotton candy. Leslie opened the box with joy as she realized that there was a sweet inside. But after a few minutes, she froze in place. She looked at the small cotton wool in surprise. And a moment later, she asked the teacher in surprise if it was really her hair in the box. The Viscountess laughed heartily and with tears in her eyes told the girl that it was just cotton candy. She asked the young lady to try the sweet. At that very moment, the young lady began tasting. She was surprised because she had never tried anything like this before. She wanted to know what cotton candy was made of, so she asked her teacher. Madame smiled and told her what cotton wool is made of. Leslie smiled as she realized the teacher's hair was not a cloud. She froze for a moment, ashamed of her behavior. That same evening, the young lady ran to her maid and told her that today she had her first etiquette lesson. She smiled and said that she had a very good teacher. She said with a smile that her room was now always warm. She noticed that there was no fire in the magic stone, and she was not afraid of anything. At the same moment, she called the maid and said that she had brought cotton candy. The maid was taken aback, as it was the first time she had seen something like this. Leslie smiled and said that the cotton wool reminded her of a cloud. She handed the maid a piece of cotton wool and invited her to try it. For some time, they happily ate cotton wool and enjoyed each other's company. Leslie thought about how much she had eaten, because she wanted to share it with all her family. Madele looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it sounded a little awkward. But to tell the truth, she had met a guest with a pink head before, and so when she first saw the cotton candy, she immediately thought of her hair. Leslie smiled brightly as she realized she wasn't the only one who had thought of this. Late in the evening, she was minding her own business and thinking about how she could become calmer. She remembered their last conversation with the princess and assumed that the parquet was up to something after all. Ruenti looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was tired already. She was taken aback as she was lost in her thoughts, and at that very moment she said that she became interested in something. He looked at her closely and said that if she was interested in something, she should ask him about everything. The young lady froze in place for a moment. She asked why he addressed her formally, since he had previously asked to be addressed differently. He said that they are such an impolite person to call just by his first name, Arkdeer. She spoke to him formally. He said that if she didn't like being addressed that way, she could go back to calling him formally. The young lady of observation thought about everything. Ruenti, looking at the girl, said that her respect for his mother was too deep. He looked at her and said that he heard from his brother that she wanted to grow up as strong as their mother. He said that such praise sounded as if she respected the princess. He waited and said that if she loved her too much, then on the contrary, it would be more difficult to call her mother. He said that his mother is a good person, and she will not be offended. She is a lady, so she will behave freely. He smiled and said that while she was with the princess, no one could hurt her. The lady smiled and thanked her brother for his support. He sighed heavily and said that she should call him brother. Leslie sighed heavily and said that the Armada didn't care about that, but she still felt sad. She said it was really sad when strangers got everything, and she alone couldn't get anything. She looked intently at the young man and asked him to wait a little. He was furious and could not understand how the Marquis dared to do this to his own children. He looked at the girl with a smile and said that not only he was waiting for her to simplify herself to him like this, but also all the other members of the family. Leslie extended her hand to him with a smile, wanting to promise that she would soon call them all by different names. At that very moment, he said that on the day she received a new surname, she would address the sky differently. She knew that she would be protected by the most noble people in the empire. At that moment, she gave him a promise with a smile. He smiled and said that they had finished preparing for the court hearing, and he hoped that his father would return soon. At that very moment, the young lady asked when the trial would be. She did not understand why the elder gentleman was absent. Ruenti sighed heavily and said that he did not know when the trial would be, since the case was not moving forward, but it would start soon. He said that the parents went to the imperial palace. She was excited about everything that was happening. She looked closely at her brother and asked if the princess had grabbed the emperor by the throat right now. He was taken aback and shocked when he heard such questions.